Django has a problem, and it has everything to do with running things later. It's really good at running things right now, but delaying them, putting them into a queue, that's just not something that Django does. Maybe at some point it will, but it's not there yet. Now, a lot of you might reach for something like Celery, but for those of you who have used Celery in any major capacity, you'll know this is a whole-on application that you need to manage yourself, especially if it starts to scale up. And in which case, we're scaling up Celery, we're not really scaling up Django, which may or may not be what you want to have happen. Now, in my case, I want to have a powerful, robust web application for my users. They don't really care what's going on in the background. In other words, they don't really care that Celery is running. They want to make sure that their application is fast, running, and really good. In which case, I really just want to focus on Django. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this one, focusing on Django, not using Celery. Now, the way we're going to start is by using Django AllAuth and LinkedIn. So we'll use AllAuth to post to LinkedIn. This process is fairly straightforward, but as soon as we want to schedule those posts out, that's where we have to add in another powerful agent or a powerful tool called Inngest. It's not an AI agent. It's just a tool that makes it really, really easy to build out workflows that you can schedule for later. Now, the process is writing a Python function and scheduling things later. Inngest will handle bits of data, send that data right back to Django for Django to execute various parts of the code. And if things fail, Inngest will bring it back up. It's really cool. I'll show you in a demo in just a moment. But the idea here is we're going to be using the local version of Inngest and Docker to just make it work on our local machine, which you can build out a very powerful automation system just doing that. But realistically, at some point, you're going to want to go into production, and in which case I'll also show you how to use Inngest Cloud to actually have a production-ready system that can do these powerful workflow automations and little steps. But of course, none of this makes a whole lot of sense without a demo, so let's take a look at it right now. Let's go ahead and do a demo and a quick walkthrough on the code. First off, I'm in the Django admin and I've got some content queued up already. I'm going to select my user that's already connected to LinkedIn through Django AllAuth and the protocol of OAuth. The idea here is we have some content that I'm going to share now. As soon as I say share now, it's going to set my publish time. I can, of course, schedule it for much later or a completely different date, but we want to see it happen right now. These other things are related to the workflow, which we'll see in just a moment, and I'm going to select to share it on LinkedIn. I designed it in a way that we can actually have a bunch of other platforms to be added at a later date if we want to. It's really straightforward there. We're going to hit save and continue editing, and what we'll see is this share at gets set automatically because it's being published right now. If I were to refresh in here, I can see that the start time has already happened, and then I can see the complete time has already happened as well. So it happened really, really quickly. If I go into LinkedIn, I can refresh on my profile here, and I can scroll on down. There's my post that I have showing, yes, I just actually shared this onto actual LinkedIn through my code. Okay, so what we want to look at now is what happened on Inngest. This is the production version of Inngest. The development version will look almost identical to this. So the idea here is we go into our metrics, we can see how this function ran, the number of times it failed, all those sorts of things. This is the dev version that we talk about later too. But we can see the completion, we can see some are running. If we look in runs here, we can see some that failed. We can dive in a little bit deeper as to what happened. So workflow start, workflow end, and a bunch of things related to LinkedIn inline. It's really cool. It's a very straightforward process. We send a small packet of data to Inngest. Inngest then sends a small packet right back to then be ran in our automation function, which is this right here. So really, we just run some standard Django code. The context is from the event itself. I'll show you that as well. Then we can actually update when this function starts. That's a straightforward process. We can get the different platforms that we want to support. That is all through the Django model and the instance that's stored. Then we can actually do the publishing where we actually run the workflow node right here. Also instance related, and that's it. So this right here is this powerful workflow automation that will run and schedule as we see fit, related to the Django model that we run with all of that as well. So this is the post model, very straightforward model with some model validation stuff. scheduled platform and a overridden save method so that we can actually send out when this post is scheduled and synced. It really becomes that simple. And of course, we also need to connect LinkedIn, which takes a little bit of time because we have to learn about OAuth and make all of those things happen. So that's naturally where we start. By using this one client, we can use this in production. We can use this in development as well through that Docker version, which I think is pretty great. I also show you how to do some of these things through Jupyter Notebooks, so you can really just see how to execute all of the different things you might need as we work our way up to using the powerful Inngest platform. So of course, if you have any questions at this time, please let me know. All of the code is already on GitHub. So if you go to cfe.sh/GitHub into the repositories, look for the social share scheduler. It's a mouthful, but it's in there and it's ready to go. You can use it in your projects right now. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, let's jump right in. We're going to start by creating a Python virtual environment to isolate our Python project, the code that we're going to use, the third-party code we're going to use from any other Python package that might be on your system or a project you've built otherwise. So the way we're going to do this is by using the default Python virtual environment manager. Now there's a lot of different ways on how you can go about doing this, but we're going to use the one that's built into Python. So make sure that you have Python installed from python.org. That's the easiest way to do it. Once you have it installed, you'll be able to open up your command line, type out Python 3 and do something like --version and hit enter. If you're on Windows, it might be a little bit different than this, but if you are on Windows, I recommend that you use the WSL package, that's Windows Subsystem for Linux. That way the Python commands are going to be very similar to what we've been doing and what we will do throughout. So with this in mind, I'm actually going to go ahead and do all of this inside of my own code editor. I'm going to be using Cursor for this course with none of the AI stuff turned on so we can all learn. Feel free to turn the AI stuff if you'd like, but I'm not going to be using it. So Cursor itself is just like VS Code, and there's many others that actually feel basically the same as Cursor. So the actual editor you use doesn't matter that much. It just, you need to be able to navigate around it, like toggling the terminal window is a key one to be able to do that as well. In my case, I'm using Control and tilde. Tilde, of course, is that sign right there. So what we want to do here is we want to create a new Python package, a new virtual environment for Python. I want to put it in a specific location. That way I can reference it at any time later. So what I'm going to do is go to Open Folder, and here I have my user and also a folder I call dev. This is just what I call it. I'm going to make a new folder in here, and we're going to call this social share. And then I'm going to go ahead and create that. We'll open up this folder. This is going to be the root of our project in here. So in this root is where we're going to create our virtual environment. I'm going to toggle open the terminal window. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that Python 3 is installed. The Python version that we're using is 3.13. The latest version is not installed on my computer, but it might be on yours depending on when you installed it. I recommend at least Python 3.10 and above. This will be different based off of the version of Django that you would end up be using, which I believe will show you in there what version of Python 3 that you'll need. I think it's 3.110. So keep that in mind. But the idea here is we're going to do Python 3 -m venv venv. We're going to go ahead and hit enter. This will create our virtual environment. Now, if you're on Windows, that process is slightly different because you have to know what version of Python you're using and how to execute it. But this is what we're going to do on Mac and Linux. And then, of course, if I do Python 3 and hit enter, it actually enters into the Python shell, which, of course, we're not going to use right now. But you'll notice that my actual project created this folder called venv. Sometimes you'll see it as .venv, sometimes you'll see it as env, but in our case, we're just calling it this folder because that's how I always name them. But the idea is after you create a virtual environment, you can then go ahead and activate that virtual environment with source venv bin/activate, and this should look something like this. And if you were to do pip freeze, nothing should be installed yet. We'll actually install the packages in just a moment, but the idea here is if you can't do this part, this might be a little bit too advanced for you. Going from here, we're going to pick up the speed a little bit because I'm going to assume that you have some fundamentals of Python down, like creating classes and functions. The Django side, I'll introduce and talk about all of that. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, let's actually install Django and get the Django project started. Now that we have our virtual environment installed and activated, let's actually install our Django project and get that started. First and foremost, as soon as I create a Python project, I almost want to always create something like requirements.txt. Now there's many variations of requirements.txt that's out there, but the idea is to keep track of the version of the code that we're using. So in our case, we're going to be using Django. And you might be wondering what version of Django. So if you go to djangoproject.org into download, you can see that there's Django 5.2. So we can use this specific version and just put it into our requirements.txt. Now, I don't think this will cause any dependency issues with third-party packages, but if it were to, then I would use just a older version of Django like Django 5.1 until a lot of the newer packages are fully supported. I know that something like the Django REST framework, there are third-party packages for that just aren't at 5.2 just yet. But Django 5.1 and Django 5.2, for the vast majority of you beginners, it's basically the exact same thing. I would even argue Django 1.10, that is almost the same thing as Django 5.2. So in this case, I'm just going to write Django. I don't need to specify the version. If there's any issues, just writing Django means that I won't run into installation issues that you might come up against later. Now, I realize for those of you who are a little further down the line, this is repetitive to you, but those of you who are just starting out, it's really important that you just kind of understand these versions change all the time. Stick with what's in the video or with what works. The video itself will definitely age, but there's going to be a lot of things about Django that will stay true. That's why I mentioned the old one. Okay, so the idea here is we're going to go ahead and do pip install -r requirements.txt to install this, actual projects file called requirements.txt that's going to keep track of all of our requirements. Now, every once in a while, you'll see this upgrade pip. Feel free to do that when it does warn you. I always do it when it warns me, so I'm going to leave it as is. Okay, so now we've got Django installed, which we can verify by doing pip freeze. Now again, my virtual environment is activated. Now a lot of the modern code editors that are out there may automatically activate your virtual environment for you. In my case, it's not activating yet, but later in the video, you might see it automatically activate, in which case I don't have to write this out every single time. So just keep that in mind in terms of how I use these virtual environments. So now that I've got Django installed, what I should be able to do is run the django-admin command, and this should just have all of these different commands listed as to additional things I can do, which means I can create my src folder. I can then go ahead and navigate into that one by doing cd src, and then doing our django-admin start project command, and then give it a project name. I name all of my projects CFE home, and then I put a period after so that it creates it inside of this src folder. If I hit enter, this is what you'll end up seeing. So when I say all of my projects, I mean everything on cfe.sh/github. If it's a Django project there and it's not super old, there's a really good chance that you'll see CFE home in there as the main configuration for Django. All we want to do now is verify that Django is running by doing python manage.py run server. You might see something like this, some sort of warning about seeing devices on local networks. I'm going to go ahead and allow it. And then I'm going to go ahead and do command click to open up Django working. Congratulations. If you've never done Django before, you now have Django running, and we are almost ready to create a user. This process is going to be really easy. Now, a big part of the reason you might want to use something like Django has everything to do with the fact that it has built-in user support. There's a lot of things that come in with that user support. One of them is the Django admin, which is also a very powerful part of Django. Now, what we're going to do is show you the simplest way to create a Django user, log into the Django admin, and see how we can create additional users. But the thing is, we eventually want to use something like Django AllAuth so that we can connect to log in a user through LinkedIn, for example, so that we can eventually post on their behalf. But at this point, let's go ahead and take a look at how to create a user in Django the old-fashioned way. First and foremost, we need to open up a new terminal window. You need to activate the virtual environment if yours is not already activated. And then you want to navigate into SRC, into the root of the Django project. In this case, you'll see CFE home and manage.py. You might see something called the db.sqlite 3. So if I do python manage.py and migrate and hit enter, what I'll see is it creates this temporary database. This is actually a really good database to use in development. It's not a database you'll want to use in production, but as you see just right there, I deleted the database and then brought it back up. So doing this allows for me to save my users and save all sorts of other data. Eventually, you'll want to upgrade to something like a Postgres or a MySQL database, but at this point, we can just use the SQLite one and we can upgrade later. Now, how do we actually create a user? It's really simple. You do python manage.py, create super user, and hit enter. Now, if it shows you something like this, that's a good sign. If it shows you something like this, let me go ahead and delete that database again, and you hit create super user. This is basically saying, hey, you don't have a database migrated. The database is not ready for Django. Let's make it ready for Django once again by running migrate and then running that create super user command, in which case it's prompting me with a user to use, which is my actual logged in user on my computer, which you can use if you want. I'm going to use a different one. I'm not going to put an email address. I'm not going to put a secure password even, because right now this is all development. Just use a whatever password so you can actually get into places. So notice that my Chrome browser is already trying to log me in to that user, and probably with the same username and password, mostly because I use it all the time during development and I store it in Chrome just so I can reuse it. Okay, so I just created the admin user. This admin user has permission by default to come in and create new users or delete users. So if we wanted to, now we can create another user altogether. So I can do something like ABC user, and then I can add in another password, and you could use the same password that you had, but if we hit save and continue editing, I now have this new user. You could test it by trying to log in to the admin. It won't work, but I'm going to go ahead and actually delete this user because I'm not going to use them. So that's a key part of using Django, is the users themselves. Now, the Django admin is the benefit that you get as well of having these users. You can log in, log out, you can do all sorts of things like that. But the challenge here is you don't want your actual end users using the Django admin. You want them to actually log in to Django itself, to your web application itself. To do that, we're going to be using Django AllAuth. Now, I want to jump right into this so we can actually have the LinkedIn stuff working as well, so we can test that part out, because that's what this project's all about. It's not so much about how to use all things Django. It's much more about how can we use the user's LinkedIn account, for example, to log in and be able to send messages on their behalf. So Django AllAuth is going to help us do this in a big way, and that has to do with the fact that it allows you to do third-party accounts. It allows you to do all sorts of things. So if you go into their Quickstart, you will see all kinds of social providers in here, including LinkedIn. But this is not the one we're going to end up using. We're not going to go ahead and set up Django AllAuth. Now, AllAuth as a package does a lot of different things. What we want it for is going to be for OAuth or OpenID Connect, which we'll see in just a little bit. But the idea here is we want to start off with installing it. Now, whenever you see these pip install commands, I usually take what's inside of the quotes, copy it, and bring it right back into requirements.txt and paste it in just like that. That way, when I go to do the pip install, if we do that, we can navigate into the root of our project here. We do pip install -r requirements.txt. It should do that installation process for us. Now, this is one of those cases where if you had a specific version of Django, it's possible that the latest version of Django does not necessarily match AllAuth just yet. So just keep that in mind when it comes to using those third-party packages. But the idea behind AllAuth is fairly straightforward. It's going to allow us to log into things. So when we go into something like accounts login on our Django project, AllAuth will actually handle this for us. Now, it's not going to look great, but it will work great. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this means. First off, we've got templates in here. It's basically saying, hey, you need to verify that the request is coming into the Django template. This comes in by default, so you shouldn't have to change anything there. So if we go into settings and just do a quick search for request, you can see that inside of templates there has the request. So we're good there. Next up, the authentication backends. This is something we will need to add. The default one is this one right here, the Django one, and then the AllAuth one is in there as well. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and actually put this at the very bottom, and I'm going to get rid of these dots here because they may raise an error. But the idea here is we're going to do our AllAuth setup down here and basically keep it in one place on the Django settings module, as you would with any other Django settings, kind of keep them all together. Now, the reason I'm putting the authentication backends way down there has to do with the fact that I have AllAuth in there as well. This is a little bit different than the installed apps. The installed apps will require us to do a bunch of different things. So first off, we are going to grab these ones here. Let's scroll on up to installed apps. And right at the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and do third party, paste these in. There's AllAuth. Then we've got AllAuth social account. Now, we're going to do the other parts in just a little bit. I really just want to see AllAuth working like a hello world to AllAuth itself. So we're going to go ahead and save that. We'll scroll on down past all of these things. There's a middleware provider that we need to grab. I'm going to go ahead and copy the value that they have, which is this one right here. You shouldn't probably copy all of the ones they have because it might override the defaults. As you can see in here, there's a few more than what's on their documentation. So I like to focus in on just the AllAuth stuff. And then we've got this social account providers. We're going to come back to this one in a little bit. The next one is adding this to our URLs. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the path here, and we're going to go into URLs, paste it right underneath here. And then in Django.urls, we're also going to import include here. Okay, so depending on your experience with Django altogether, you define all of your URLs in this urls.py. So basically, you don't do it at functions like you might with FastAPI or Flask. You do it in one module, which is going to be urls.py. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do it the other way. There are ways to make it more FastAPI or Flask-like, but this is where we do the URLs. This is pretty fundamental Django. So if you want to know more about this, you should check out my Try Django series. I got a lot of them, and there's a lot of getting started with Django stuff that I've done. But nevertheless, we now have basically all of AllAuth ready and installed. So going back into the Django project on the URL, what I should see here is it actually redirects me to account/profile. So if I go back into accounts login, it automatically brings me back to profile. Now, why is this? Well, this happens to be because I'm actually logged into the admin. If I were to log out of the admin and then once again go into accounts/login, hit enter, I now get this no such table. So anytime you see something that says no such table, that means your database and your Django project are out of sync in some way, like the code that you have in Django hasn't been migrated into the database itself. So all that means is we want to run into src, run python, manage.py, and then migrate. Hit enter. Then it creates all of the AllAuth things in here that you might want. As soon as you do that, you refresh the page, you can see you can sign in and sign up. Great. So we can verify that we can sign in. As soon as I do, notice it takes me back to accounts profile again. If I go into accounts login, it redirects me there. So this is the standard Django redirect URL for when a user logs in for the first time. This is not specific to AllAuth. AllAuth is working off of Django configuration, which we can look at in a little bit. But the idea here is if I go into accounts logout, this is now back to a Django AllAuth page that I can now sign out with. I can also change email, change password. I can do my account connections, like the third-party connections. I can do all sorts of things like that. So obviously we're going to be building on top of this, but there's a few caveats that we're not going to be touching in this one. One of them has to do with email. So if you go into regular accounts in the doc under configuration, you'll see this thing called sending email. And you can actually send emails through OAuth. It's actually going through Django, but OAuth can actually send them for you with templates and all sorts of cool things to do email verification, resetting your email, magic links, codes, all sorts of things that you might want to do with email. OAuth is very powerful for a lot of that. And I believe my SaaS Foundations course does cover some of those things. But the idea here is we're now at a point where we want to start integrating OAuth with LinkedIn so that our login portion, so if we go back into accounts and log in, we want to see LinkedIn show up here. We want it to be an option that the user can have to log in. We want to integrate LinkedIn with our Django project through Django AllAuth. So if we go into AllAuth's documentation, into third-party accounts, and you scroll on down to providers, what you'll end up seeing is a configuration for LinkedIn. So we're going to go on down here and we'll see that there's this LinkedIn configuration here. Now, what you're also seeing is it doesn't actually say things that are specifically LinkedIn. Instead, it says OpenID_connect. This didn't used to be the case. LinkedIn has adopted the OpenID connect like standard. So that's the format that we're going to be setting it up in. And so we can actually just copy this right here and we can bring it into our own project by jumping into our settings module, and we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom and paste that in. So there we go. We've got provider ID, name, client ID, secret. Of course, we still need those things. And then you see there's this server URL. Now, OAuth itself has a lot of options. And some providers do some things, some providers do other things. That configuration will then go to the provider's documentation, which we'll come back to very soon. But the idea here is, of course, if you go back into third-party accounts under OAuth 2.0, this will now show you there's the OpenID Connect stuff. There's a lot more things in here, as well as many other providers. So you can have more than one enabled as you see fit, which is what we see here. So with this in mind, I want to continue with the configuration of these providers. So when we want to go ahead and use this, we've got this installed app here. Let's go back into our Quickstart where it actually had a big old list of stuff. So in here, we've got our social account. We want to look for OpenID Connect in here, right? So that is one of the apps we're going to go ahead and use. So we need to bring that into our installed apps now. So this is for OpenID, but also LinkedIn. Right? Now, I have definitely covered it before where we used the LinkedIn provider and as well as LinkedIn OAuth. That's not necessary anymore. All we need is this OpenID Connect. The concepts here are going to persist. The OAuth standard and OpenID, which is one of the OAuth standards, makes it very easy to move these things around and also customize and build your own as you see fit if you want to get more advanced. In our case, we are not customizing anything other than the fact that we're providing Django AllAuth some credentials and some configuration to use all of the things it already has built in place for us. So that's the key thing there as far as the configuration. So now, of course, we need our client ID and secret. So this comes up to, well, what is it that we want to do with these client ID secrets? Should I just put it in here or should I do it elsewhere? Now, most of the time I would say that the actual social account providers, this right here, I would actually skip that one and not even do it right in the code. Instead, what I would do is I would go into the Django admin, and then let's go ahead and jump into the admin, into social applications. I would go ahead and create a new OpenID Connect provider, and then go ahead and add in LinkedIn as our provider ID with a name of LinkedIn, and then a client ID, secret, and so on. And then I've got these settings here. Well, these settings are the same. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this one right here. We'll paste that in. We really just need the server URL and we need to get rid of the trailing comma because this needs to be JSON encoded. That is JSON in order for this to work correctly. So the idea here is we want to set it up just like that, double quotes and all. So there we go. Now, of course, the next question would be, where does the client ID and secret key come from? Well, now you're going to need to log into your LinkedIn account. You're going to likely need to actually use your actual account for this one. Otherwise, it might not work correctly or just won't allow you to create an app. After you do that, I like going to developer.linkedin.com. This might redirect you, or you click on My Apps, and then you go into where you're going to go ahead and create your application. So this is actually a very straightforward process. You hit Create App. I'm going to call this my Rocket Schedule poster. The LinkedIn page that I'm using here is going to be my own. You might have to create a page. It's really easy to make these pages. It says something about individual developers too. I haven't actually explored that one myself, but just select a page because it's telling you to do so. And then you want to add in a logo. I went ahead and did a screenshot of the rocket emoji just to use that one for now. And I'll agree to the terms and go ahead and create my app. So I'm not going to do anything with the available products or scopes just yet. All I'm going to do is go into Auth, grab this client ID here, bring it back into my Django admin client ID, and then grab the secret key and bring that one back in there as well into that secret key, and just go ahead and hit save and continue. You now have LinkedIn connected through your database. So if you were to delete your database, things would fall apart, in which case this is not always the greatest method for that reason. So I'm going to show you how to set this up again in a little bit, but for now we'll go ahead and leave it just in the database to test the next part, which would be to actually log out of our Django project and then go into our accounts login. Now we see that LinkedIn, it looks like I did a typo there. LinkedIn is in here. If I go to click on this, it says I'm about to sign in this way. I hit continue. This now is trying to take me to LinkedIn. You can see that it says linkedin.com, OAuth, but it says the redirect URI did not match the registered value. Okay, so this is something we will still need to fix, as well as this LinkedIn stuff, and we will definitely come back to it. If I were to log into my admin user, I could change the typo here just back to LinkedIn and save that one. We left it off where our redirect URI has an issue, an error with the LinkedIn side. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and copy this entire URL that it's giving me, because it actually gives me a lot of information that will help me understand what's going on. I'm going to paste this in here, and all I want to do is basically, whenever it says a question mark, I'm going to go ahead and hit enter there. And then whenever there's the and or ampersand, I'll get rid of it and hit enter after that. Now, there are other things in here that you might want to take a look at, but the idea is I'm seeing basically what's breaking down everything that's going on with this URL. So notice that there's a redirect URI directly in the URL. This is actually really interesting. Scope, response type, and state we can ignore for right now, but this redirect URI looks a lot like our own local host. Now, you might not be familiar with these, but if you actually change them into their counterpart, what you'll get is a URL that starts to look a lot more like what our URLs have been looking like, right? So we've got LinkedIn, a login, callback, and there we go. We've uncovered the actual redirect URL on our local computer. If we were not using our local computer, this would be our production endpoint, but we're using our local one. So I'm going to go ahead and test it out with this right here. Now, all I really need to test out is the fact that this path actually works. I'm going to open it up in my web browser. Now I get this third-party login failure. That's good because it's showing my Django projects running, and this is a URL that seemingly works, versus doing something like, /login or some gibberish that doesn't make sense, right? Django's actually trying to handle this URL, which tells me that I've got something working correctly and something that's broken. Now, how I go about actually solving this redirect URI has everything to do with our app itself and the products available. So what we want to do here is go into our app under products and scroll on down to sign in with LinkedIn using OpenID Connect. Whoa, what do you know? I'm going to go ahead and hit request access. I'm going to read the terms. I'm going to go ahead and request it now so that it can actually allow for me to attempt this process. So now if I were to scroll on down, what I should see is I should see the login. Oh, there it is right here. Here's the sign in with LinkedIn. That is now, there is permission now to do this with the OpenID Connect standard, which again is OAuth still, but it's a very standardized process for OAuth. So if I go back into the auth screen though, I can see that there's these OAuth 2.0 settings and authorized redirect URLs for your app. Here's where I can now put in that one that we just looked at. And so if you were to have a public domain, you would do something like, let's say hungrypie.com/accounts. It'd basically be the same thing, but you would want to make sure that wherever the user's requesting it is also in one of these redirects. And with LinkedIn in particular, you should be able to put a bunch of them in there. At this time, LinkedIn does not require you to only use HTTPS. Other services will absolutely require that, and we'll take a look at that soon enough. But the idea here is now we've got this redirect URL on our LinkedIn account. And so I'm going to go ahead and open that up, and I'll do accounts/login now. Notice I've been switching around different tabs and different browsers, incognito window, different users. This has to do with just the fact that my LinkedIn user is only on this particular Chrome browser account. It's not on this one or this one. That's all. So now that we've got this, I'm going to go ahead and grab this, use this third-party one. I'll try and sign in with LinkedIn. There, it's now prompting me for my email and password, in which case I'm going to go ahead and sign in. And now it's, asking me, hey, do you want this to happen? I'm going to go ahead and say yes. And then it redirects me back to Django. And this is pretty great. If I were to look at Django in the admin, I can now see that this is the new user and this is from LinkedIn, which is even more obvious if we go into social accounts here. We see the user of Justin. I select that user and there we go. It shows me provider of LinkedIn. And then I've got some other LinkedIn related information down below. At this point, we have a full-on completed login flow with LinkedIn. We can log out of our user. We can then re-log back in. And it's very straightforward to do and something users might get really, really familiar with. And of course, you know that you're logged in by going into the logout page. It shows you everything that you can do with your particular user. So what we want to do though is we want to make a slight modification to Django AllAuth. So if I were to jump into my other window that has the admin session still active, I can see there's this thing called social application tokens. In other words, the actual user token is not being stored whatsoever. This token will allow for us to do API requests on the user's behalf. That is, doing those automations on that user's behalf. So if we were to jump back into AllAuth and do a quick search for, let's say, token, I want to find something where I'm saving my user token. Maybe it's save token. The search is okay, but here's the actual response here. It's social accounts store tokens. If I were to search for that, I now see configuration in here and do a quick search and there it is. So the way you could also do it without doing the search is by coming in here, third-party accounts, into configuration, look for tokens, and there we got our social account store tokens. By default, it is false, as in it's not going to store those things unless you need it to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and say true. I'm going to put this setting into my settings.py. I'll put it above the account providers here, and I'll go ahead and say true. Now, there's a possibility to where you can actually put this single argument inside of the OpenID Connect as well, to where it will definitely store the tokens. But at this point, it just doesn't. And again, we can verify that in the admin. So all we really need to do is log out again of our user and then log in again. And there we go. Logging in again, logged in. Now if I refresh in the Django admin, I now have a token. This is going to be the token we use with the API itself to do all sorts of things related to this particular user and the permissions that we have granted in these different products that are available. Off the video, I activated Git for version control, as well as a few files that are related to that as well. At this point, what I want to do is I want to use Jupyter notebooks. These are interactive Python notebooks that allow me to write Python code and execute it in a way that I find very compelling. So inside of requirements.txt, we're going to go ahead and do Jupyter, and then I'll just go ahead and open up a terminal here. In my case, I need to activate it, and then I'll go ahead and do pip install -r requirements.txt just to make sure that it is activated. Now, I created this tool a while back called Rav. The reason I have that is so that I can do rav.yaml and do some scripts and do something like notebook and then have venv bin/Jupyter notebook. And so that's another thing that you might want to add in as well. Those two are somewhat optional, but can be pretty useful when it comes to running things. So if I do rav run notebook now, it will actually run this script right here, which will open up a Jupyter Notebook server for me in my web browser. And notice that it's basically the same thing as inside of Cursor. What I want to do inside of this Jupyter Notebook server, though, is I'm going to make a new folder in here. This new folder I'm going to call Notebooks. This is going to be where I'm going to prototype a bunch of different code before I put it into the Django project of it all. So inside of Notebooks here, this is also, I'm going to go ahead and create a new Python 3 kernel, which is exactly what I did there. That might have went by kind of fast, but you just select Python 3. It's going to create a new file for you. This file I'm going to rename to hello world like that. And all I want to do to start out is just print out hello world and hit enter, or shift enter rather. So you have to use shift, not just enter. Using enter will make the cell bigger, which is nice. Using shift enter will actually execute that cell, and it's doing so in the browser, but it's running in our virtual environment as well. So if you were to do pip freeze, you would be able to shift enter that, and you would see all of the things that are installed like Django and Django AllAuth related to all of these different packages we have. Now, of course, the big question here is why do this in the first place? Well, it has to do with Django. So if I were to do from django.contrib.auth, import the get user model method here, and then we want to initialize that with get user model like this, and then we can try to use the user, but we get this problem. In other words, Jupyter and Django don't play nice together without one more step, which is a really simple one. And I already have the code available on cfe.sh/github under social status scheduler. Notice that there's a notebooks in here, and there's a file called setup.py. We just want to go ahead and copy that raw file. Inside of Cursor here, I can go into notebooks here and do setup.py, paste that in there, and you'll see something along these lines. You probably don't need to keep the database URL in there. You totally could if you're using Postgres and all of those configurations. In my case, I'm not, so I'm just going to leave it in as setup.py. Okay, so now in order to use the setup.py, I just go into any given notebook, and I can import setup at the very top, and then do setup.init and run that. Hit shift enter, and now when I go to run Django related things like user.objects.all and seeing what that query set is, I can now see my two users in here. And more specifically, if I were to grab my Justin LinkedIn user, that would be .git and the username equaling to Justin. That's mine, of course, because of that right there. And then I can actually see this user and some attributes about this user as well, right? And so this is what we really want to be able to do. We want to be able to use all of this stuff in prototyping with Jupyter Notebooks. Now, I will say a lot of times I also end up using Cursor for it because you can run those notebooks in there as well. It's just sometimes the configuration is not really all that friendly where you can use it in either one, the Jupyter Notebook server or directly in Cursor or VS Code or whatever other editor you might be using. And all you need to do to open it up is Jupyter Notebook in the root of your project so that then you can use all of the Django stuff. If you look at setup.py, there's a few key things about our specific project that make a whole lot of sense. So in the case of the actual Django project root is inside of this SRC folder here, and then the Django settings module, when we created that Django project, it's in CFE home. Now you can actually find where the settings module is by going into manage.py. It will also have basically the same thing in there, which is of course why I made it this way on purpose. But the point here is allowing asynchronous calls, which is what Jupyter Notebooks do. But realistically, just being able to call a bunch of different things related to Django inside of a Jupyter Notebook is going to be really useful for us when it comes to actually using the APIs that we might want to use to do various posting. Let's take a look. Before we do LinkedIn specific things, let's actually take a look at how we can use Django users to grab the auth token itself. As a reminder, jumping back into the admin, the auth token is in these social application tokens here. You can actually take a look at the token right there, right? So that's my actual auth token, which of course will not be active by the time you're watching this, but this token itself, you don't want to share with anybody. However, we still need to be able to use it. So let's take a look at how that's done through the notebooks themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this last one that we had, and I'll go ahead and rename it to 02 AllAuth LinkedIn user token, something like that. Let's open that up. I like using dashes in there just to make it a little bit easier for the file saving process. Next up, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and do kernel and restart and clear all outputs here. And I'll get rid of that print statement. We no longer need that. And then my user request, I'm going to go ahead and say user equals to get, and there's going to be username equals to something, and we of course want to grab that username. Now, if I jump back into the Django admin, my username is simply Justin, and yours might be simply different, so feel free to use whatever username you have there. And then back into your Jupyter Notebook here, I'm going to go ahead and grab and make sure I can see that user by running each one of these cells with just Shift-Enter on each one. So now that I've got that, I can actually do something like dir of user, and you can see a bunch of different attributes of this user instance itself. So one of the things, if you were to scroll all the way down, you'll eventually see social account underscore set. Now, this is a foreign key relation. What that means is I can actually use that user instance, right? So I actually looked this up from the database. Then I did this dir to see all of the different attributes that are in there, like user.username, for example. You can do that. But if I do social account underscore set and hit enter, I see this. But if I do .all, then I get all of them available. This is quite literally a query set. It's similar to like doing social, I think it might be a social account.objects.all, or more specifically, filter the user being the user. This query set is probably wrong. I don't necessarily have that one right. But the idea here is this social account data is all associated to this particular user, right? It's the same thing as coming in here and basically narrowing down all of the different social accounts that you might have for any given user. Well, actually, it's this one right here. Okay, so this user has one social account, but it can have a lot of them thanks to AllAuth as well, which is why this is a list of items. So if we actually grab the very first one, this will be our user social account. And this is really just our user LinkedIn, something along those lines. So if we actually take a look at it, we can do that same thing again with dir of that social account and just see what's available to us in there. It's going to be further down the line as to what's available, but we see ID, we've got some objects in there, we've got provider. Provider might be interesting, so let's go ahead and try that one with .provider, hit enter. Hey, what do you know? It says LinkedIn. We also have this other underscore set, which is social token. So we can do user LinkedIn social token set.all, and now we see tokens. And those are all equal to all of that. And so there we go. And then we can now say our social token equals to tokens.first, and then this will give us out a token instance, which once again, we could do that dir in there. So let's go ahead and do dir here. And now we can see a lot less fields that are available, but the one that we really want is this token field. So that's the one we would end up using. And so I would go ahead and do the social token. Let's just comment out the dir now and just do .token. And there we go. So this is now accessing that database entry that's in there. That's this data right here. So you could always copy and paste it, but really we probably don't want to copy and paste it, but you could set it equal to each other like that just to verify it. I put it into a big string and stuff like that. But overall, you probably are just going to want to use the social token.token directly, because you never want to actually expose this anywhere. In other words, I probably wouldn't even print it out inside of this request either. So it's no longer in the notebook whatsoever, because if you do submit this notebook into GitHub, it will actually expose that user's token, which is not great. But luckily for us, we could always delete that token and start again. So if I came in here and deleted this user's token, what I would need to do then is actually just have that user re-log in. So just re-authenticate. So they would have to log out, and then accounts log in, and there we go. So we'd actually get a new token from that process right there, where we log in again, and there we are. And then I go back into the admin, there's that token. Should be a different token this time because the other one would have been either deleted or just not stored, so it's a new one's generated when a new session happens. So this is one of the reasons you want to store it, but also a big caveat in the world of security. A big part of the reason why you think of something like LinkedIn, why they even have these apps in the first place, is to help verify the security. So if anything seems to be going wrong, they can just shut down the app and that app can no longer share on LinkedIn whatsoever. Now in our case, we don't even have permission to share yet. We only have a way to get the user's token, which is pretty straightforward. But let's go ahead and take a look at how we might start sharing. Let's start building out the functionality to share on LinkedIn. If we go into our app under products, the share on LinkedIn, we're going to take a look at the docs themselves. So the docs have a few things. First off, authenticating members. We've actually done a lot of this. It's not completely done yet, but we have done a lot of the authentication with all that OAuth stuff. There is this scope that we will need to bring in. There's also a way to create this request. So this is the API endpoint, and it requires this header. So it requires at least two headers here. So we can start there as we build out some other stuff. So going back into Jupyter, I'm going to duplicate this last one because we will need that token. So I'll duplicate it, and I'm now going to rename this, and we'll call this something like LinkedIn Share. And let me just open it up, and I'll rename it in here. Sometimes that's easier. LinkedIn User Share .ipython notebook. Great. So the idea is I should have this social token down here, and then this is how we will actually get that token. I also want to make sure that I can actually import something called requests or Python requests. And it looks like I can. This will allow me to do an HTTP request or an API request. So what we've got here is this right here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we'll go ahead and come into our most recent one, and we'll say endpoint equals to, well, it's not post, but rather just this URL here. The method is going to be post, but the way we use Python requests is we don't have to hard code that method. But I did see that there was a header that needed to be in there. There's a headers requirement. So going back into the documentation, all requests require the following header, and that's a key value pair here, which means I would use a dictionary in here as well, which is basically like that. Great. So far, so good. Now the data that I would actually use, since it's a post request, whenever you see an API post request, that means you're posting or sending data to that API endpoint. So think of it like mail. The other HTTP request types are like GET, like going to a web page. And of course, if you do go to a web page and open up your terminal, what you will see is the different request types that are in there right in the terminal as well, which is pretty cool. So now that we've got this, API request that posts, the endpoint that's going, and then the header, let's take a look at the request body schema. Now, to me, this is not that easy to understand what's going on here. What's really easy to understand is just by looking at the request data, the example data right here. I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we'll bring this on in as well. So I'm going to go ahead and come down here, and we're going to go ahead and say data equals to that data. Okay, so the very first thing is I see that it says author. This is something I will have to unpack for sure. But for now, the other parts, well, we've got specific content here. Here is some content. This is my first share on LinkedIn with my app. And I'll put in a rocket ship there. And there we go. Cool. That's it. So that's going to be what I send. We can also call this our payload if we want. But of course, this is not the correct author. So what I want to do is I want to grab this author. The reason I know it's not correct is because it's just on their documentation. More than likely, this would be just a placeholder. I don't think it's the correct one, but I do want to change it. So I'm going to go ahead and now add in a new shell or a new cell here. And I'll go ahead and say user ID equals to something. Okay, so we need to find out what the user ID is. Now I could go into the Django admin and figure this out, but I already have a few things in place to try and figure it out. And that's this user LinkedIn. So let's go back in and do that dir again. If I scroll on down here, what I might see in here is something like user ID. Now, this should not be the Django user ID, but rather the OAuth user ID. We can verify this in two ways. But first off, let's go ahead and do our user LinkedIn, and we got user ID. That actually looks like the actual user ID that is stored in the database. So that's probably not the right one. So let's go ahead and try something maybe different in the UID. So we'll go ahead and do UID now. That one's different. So user ID is the same thing as our LinkedIn.user.id, which this one's stored in the database. And we can verify that all of that information by coming in here and doing user.id, and there we go. So it was just a gut feeling, and then I went through it and said, oh, okay, that is one single digit. There's a good chance that it's not the correct one for LinkedIn. There's almost no chance that I'm the third user ID on LinkedIn because I haven't been on it that long, and I was not part of the founding team or something like that. But UID, which is just another way to say user ID, in this case, Django AllAuth, that's how it's storing the provider's user ID. So there it is right there. This is going to be now my user ID that I'll use, and that's what I'm going to use in place of this right here, which I'll just do some string substitution or F string substitution like that. Okay, so I now have a payload that's ready to go, assuming that I stored my user ID in there somewhere, and there we go. Now the payload's ready. So let's go ahead and try this. We can actually try to send it. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so it's a little easier to see all three things happening. But we're going to use Python requests with a response equaling to request.post. So this is where we're using that method. We put it right there. Then we put the endpoint itself. Then we are going to use JSON data for our payload. And then we're going to use our headers in here for headers. And then we'll go ahead and see what our response is with raise for status. I believe that's what it's called. Let's go ahead and run that. And what we get is a 401 unauthorized. Okay, so we have an unauthorized error. There's a number of reasons why it's unauthorized. The very first one would be the token itself. We actually don't have the user's social token, so we need to change that. And we do this in a very standard way, and that is by setting an authorization header and using a bearer token, which just says something like that. And so this token itself needs to be the social auth token. So I'll go ahead and do something along those lines. Now I've updated my headers. Let's make sure that I've got the syntax right with the comma there. And we're going to go ahead and try and run it again. This time it's different. It's a 403. This is saying forbidden. So once again, if we comment out the authorization header and try that again, I get unauthorized. So forbidden just means that I can't do this. This is an authorized request, but I'm forbidden from doing it. So it's subtle, but it's different. It's definitely different in how this is working. Now, of course, the reason this isn't working is twofold. One, our app itself does not have this available product. And two, there's something going on with the scopes, which is something that I mentioned in the getting started portion. The very first thing talks about the scope. So we need to solve both of those things, and we'll do that in the next part. We now need to solve two things to share on LinkedIn. The first one is going to be requesting access to do so inside of our app itself. You want to agree to these terms, go ahead and say yes. Now, this is definitely something that you may have to wait to get access for. They may or may not let you just do it out of the gates. In my case, I have a page on LinkedIn that's already approved. I verified my information on LinkedIn. I've done a bunch of things in terms of LinkedIn itself, which has made this process a little bit easier for me. And then activating this may or may not have any other implications. Now, the only reason I'm saying that is because a lot of this is outside the control that we have on using these tools. I tried to make a throwaway account and it simply was banned like 10 minutes after doing it. So I have to use my actual LinkedIn account for this one. So the idea is I now have my, actual share on LinkedIn as an added product that's on here. It does have endpoints. It does have documentation that you can learn more about, of course. But in my case, what I need to do is I need to grant an additional scope onto my project. This scope is this W member social scope. That's what we need to grant. So how do we actually go about granting additional scopes? Well, if we go into our settings here in our social providers, if you were doing it directly in code, you would go into your settings here and write out scope, and you would add in a list of scopes in here, which of course we are not going to be doing in here, but you'd have a list of scopes in here that you would want to use for that one, right? And so right now that's the scope. If you wanted to follow standard OpenID scopes, you might see a scope a little bit different where it has OpenID, profile, also the W_member social, as well as email. So having that scope is going to then prompt your user whenever they authenticate next, whenever they log in next, if we want to allow this Django project or this web app to be able to do that on my behalf. You might say no, and in which case it now cannot do the social scheduling for you. You did not give it permission to do so. So a lot of different permissions in here to make sure that's working. Now, this scope in some cases, like in the case of LinkedIn, would have a scope like this. In the case of Meta, Facebook, Google with YouTube, you may or may not have similar scopes in there as well. So those are very specific to the provider that you're working with. Now, this scope as well, we can copy it and we can bring it into our Django admin where I actually have my social application set up. So the same settings location, you can just bring it in there. Just make sure there's not a trailing slash and make sure you're using double quotes all around. Otherwise, you might run into some errors here. You can also drop this into a JSON verifier just to make sure that's working as well. But the idea is we now have new scopes. So let me go back into my user's account. I'm going to go ahead and log out here. I'm going to log back in and we'll go ahead and see if it prompts me for anything else. So it's prompting me to log back into LinkedIn. No surprise here, really. I'm going to log back in. Now it's prompting me for additional things, specifically create, modify, and delete posts, comments, and reactions. So in other words, the things that we want to do to automate all of this. I'm going to go ahead and say allow, and now we have a brand new scope available for us for sharing data. So I already have my profile up and about, and I've got activity in here for my posts. So what I want to do is I now want to try inside of my Jupyter notebook. I'm just going to restart the kernel here, because I want to refresh everything out. Now I want to see if this ends up working. It still might fail, but it also might work just fine. So hello world, my first share on LinkedIn with my app. We're going to go ahead and run that, and we get a forbidden still. So maybe there's something else that I need to verify with the tokens and all that. Certainly a possibility that something went wrong with my tokens or with what was saved or the permissions and so on. But overall, I think the actual agreeing on the application itself should have actually updated the scope too. So as in the scope should actually work in here, but maybe there's something else going on with the request itself. At this point, that's all we're going to talk about with scopes and this part. Now we can actually diagnose this error, whatever's going on. It could also just need a minute to actually refresh all of the permissions, which is something else we'll try as well. So after about a minute, it actually was able to share. So let's go ahead and go through it again. I cleared out the kernel and cleared out all the cells as well inside of the Jupyter notebook. We're going to go ahead and do this again. And so I'm going to go ahead and just bring it on down, and then we'll get to the payload itself. Now the payload, I want to change this payload because I actually did submit this already. So I'm going to go ahead and do something like, hello LinkedIn with my app and new tutorial, something like that. There's my payload. I'm now going to go ahead and run this response. I get something going through. If I look at the JSON there for the response, here's the share ID. If I try to post it again, I'm going to get an error. This one is a 422 error. And if I take a look at the text for that, maybe even the JSON, what it shows me is the duplicate post was detected. So it just knows that the actual text that I put in here was identical. That's all. So if you accidentally run it 2 times, it's going to block you, which is pretty nice. Next up, what we want to see is it back in LinkedIn that the post actually came through. So if I come on here onto my account, there it is right there, same exact text that I had in my project itself. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Okay, great. So at this point, we can now share onto LinkedIn. All I need to do now is make this a reusable function so that I don't have to run the notebook every time, but rather just pass in the text and maybe the user that's attempting to do this. That will make things a lot more easy for us, in which case we want to build out some helper functions to make that happen. Let's take a look. We're now going to create a helper function to make it really easy for us to share on LinkedIn for any given user. So the way this is going to work, of course, is by inside of our SRC, we're going to create a new folder called helpers. We're going to turn it into a Python module with the 2 underscores or dunder init 2 underscores.py. And then I'm just going to go ahead and do something like linkedin.py. And I'm just going to go ahead and define share. And it's going to be our user and then our text, which is going to be a string. And then we will go from there. So the idea then is we want to go back into our notebook. I'm going to zoom out a little bit just to make it a little easier for me. I will have a user object coming in here. So I don't necessarily need to do anything other than that, but I can also verify that it is a user object. Otherwise we can run some sort of error, in which case I would say that, if not is instance, and this is going to be our user of user. Then we'll go ahead and say raise exception. And we'll just go ahead and say something like must be a user. Okay, there we go. And then the next one is going to be our text. Okay, so how are we going to go about doing this? Well, there's a lot of different options, of course, but realistically, it's just going to be this payload here, right? So we've got our payload, our user ID. This is going to be our LinkedIn user ID, which is still a big question mark. So that's going to be that now. And then, of course, the text itself is going to be a string substituted text as well. So we'll go ahead and paste that in like that. Everything else, I don't think I really need to change. Next up is going to be our headers in here. So this stuff right here. Right? And so I don't need the method anymore. I do need to get the user token. So I'll go ahead and define, let's call this get headers, or let's call these get share headers for the user, and in which case we would then return back these same headers here. but of course I need a social token. And so let's go ahead and scroll back up a little bit. And first and foremost, we need to get our user LinkedIn stuff. So how we're going to do this? Well, we are wanting to do something very similar to what we had, but I'm going to go ahead and do it a little bit different by doing user set.get, and we'll say provider equals to LinkedIn. Let's see if this one ends up working correctly. And I want to .get for a reason. So that one ends up working. So we'll go ahead and now say LinkedIn social equals to user.get, or rather try. And then if there's an exception, then we'll go ahead and raise an exception and say LinkedIn is incorrect or not working. Now, this exception should be much better, probably, but I'm going to leave it as that. This also might mean that the user model for some reason is not working correctly on that push, but in this case, we've got at least something here. So I'm going to go and do headers equals to get share headers for that user. So it's after that exception altogether, and there we go. Okay, so we've got our LinkedIn social, but the next thing is not just the provider, which that is now working. We want to get the token. So how many tokens can this user have? More than likely it'll be one. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing. This time it's going to be a query set instead of get, because it's very specific to this. This one being the provider is very specific to that, of course. So we'll go ahead and call this LinkedIn social. And now we'll go ahead and say if not tokens exists, then we'll go ahead and raise exception LinkedIn, something like LinkedIn. Let's do that again. Tokens are invalid. Finally, the token or the social token equals to tokens.first. And there we go. So now we've got our headers in there for this share. Fairly straightforward. Everything else looks roughly the same. Then we just return requests.post of that payload, the endpoint, and so on. So JSON equals to payload, and then headers equals to headers. And let's make sure request is in here. So import requests. And there we go. So let's go ahead and get our LinkedIn user ID. Next one. Let's go ahead and figure out where that was. So we've got our user ID here, and that comes in from our user LinkedIn. Okay, so this means then I want to actually change this a little bit. So we'll go ahead and say get LinkedIn user details from the user. And this one now is going to be this right here. And that will return LinkedIn social, in which case we will go ahead and do something like that. And then this actually might mean that we want to have LinkedIn social as the thing that comes in here, not the user. So let's do that instead. So we'll call this LinkedIn social, in which case I'm not calling the function many, many times. So LinkedIn social will be the thing that gets our headers. And of course, we could always pass in the token directly there if we wanted to make it a little bit different. But with LinkedIn social, what we had was the user ID. So that's our user LinkedIn. That's the same thing as the LinkedIn social, and that's going to be our user ID. And so I can now do that. And if not user ID, then we'll go ahead and raise exception and say invalid LinkedIn user ID. And that is now going to be just simply, let's go ahead and actually call it LinkedIn user ID, just so it's not confusing in the future. And there we go. So now there is our share request. And maybe we call this a share request or something like that. Or let's go ahead and say post to LinkedIn. How about that? That might be a little bit better. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's go ahead and duplicate our hello world and rename this. So we'll rename it for, and this will be LinkedIn helper function. Okay, and we'll set up our Django project, and we'll still use that user. I'll go ahead and say Justin user, and this will get my LinkedIn user, username and Justin. There we go, and our text will be this is working so well. Have you seen it? Cool. Let's go ahead and run all of the cells now. And then we need to bring in this helper function. So we'll go ahead and do import helpers and helpers.linkedin.post to LinkedIn. This is not LinkedIn. Yep. Post to LinkedIn. And it's going to take in our user and then our text. Yes, that was the order. And if everything went well, then we did things right. So it looks like maybe helpers. So we'll just do it a little bit differently. And I'll do from helpers. And we'll import linked in. There, that's better. And then we'll go ahead and do linkedin.post. And we get a response of 201. Yay. And then we look at our post. Let me refresh on my profile here. And there it is. Cool. So now that we've got that, I'm going to go ahead and just delete it real quick. We now have a way to easily post for a user, assuming that they have all these other details. If they don't have those details, all of those exceptions will come up, which of course is something worth testing. We can always really quickly test it by going into our recent helper function and do a different user that does not have LinkedIn in there, in which case we get LinkedIn is incorrect or not working, right? So that exception is now coming through. Where was it? It was this one right here. This user does not have that social account. So LinkedIn is not connected on this user. That's probably better. LinkedIn tokens are invalid. Please log in again. Or LinkedIn connection is invalid. Please log in again. Which might also be an exception that you end up having with the request itself, which is outside the scope of what we're probably wanting to do. But I can go ahead and do something like this, where it's the response, and then we could do response and raise for status again, which will raise an error, which we have seen, right? So we've got this raise for status thing here, and in which case I can do try and accept and have my own exception, which would be raise exception, and we'll go ahead and say invalid post, please try again later. Otherwise, we'll return back the response. Okay, so this could be improved in a number of ways, one of which is all of the error handling. I added so many different exceptions that this isn't super elegant, but it will work pretty well for us in the short term as we continue to build something like this out. But we now have a helper function that's going to make it a lot easier whenever we want to call a way to post our actual, LinkedIn messages. In which case, now we can start the process of actually scheduling these things out, which is something we definitely want to do. I don't think there's that much more that I'll want to do in terms of the LinkedIn connection itself. There's some things that I would think about in terms of how to approach this going forward. What I might want to do is actually have all of the posts that I'm going to post for a user available, at a moment's notice, so I can actually see the history of the posts that may or may not be posted on LinkedIn or any other social network, as we'll see. We now want our posting to LinkedIn to be based off of our database, so we can actually put some information into the database and then toggle a field to actually send it to LinkedIn. Let's start that process now. First off, we want to be in the root of the Django project so we can run python manage.py. Of course, when you run that, you should see something called start app. Now, I think of start app as like start component, start a smaller piece of the bigger pie that is Django. So we do start app, and I'm going to call the app posts. Typically speaking, the Django apps themselves are going to be plural in the case of, especially when you have a database operation of some kind. So we do start app posts, and then we're going to go into models.py. This is where we're going to define our database table. Now, if you've never done this before, it's a lot like defining a spreadsheet with column names and column types. That's essentially what we're doing. We're giving a bunch of column names so that every time we add a new post in, that's a new row in our database. So this is actually pretty obvious when we use the Django admin, as we'll see in a moment. Now I'm going to name the actual model itself post. So the app is going to be plural, the model is going to be singular. So we'll go ahead and do post is models.model, and we'll go ahead and start the process of defining this model. First off, we need content, and this is going to be of a data type called text field. This is going to be required. The post absolutely needs to have content, otherwise we just won't write a post. That's kind of the idea here. Now, of course, you could always look at the Django field reference, the actual documentation for all of the different model fields there are, because there are a lot of them. And of course, we've got char field or character field is one of the most popular as well. We've got a Boolean field in here, and then of course our text field. There are a number of other ones that you might consider. I did mention with AllAuth that you had to have JSON formatted content. That is likely using the JSON field inside of Django itself. Okay, so the idea here then is we've got our content. What's next? What do we need to know about this post? Well, we implemented AllAuth so that we can use users. So it's going to be a post for an individual user, which of course makes a whole lot of sense. This then is going to be something called a foreign key. Now, what a foreign key allows us to do is it allows us to actually connect our Django project, or rather this model, with another model. Right? So you can see this in the documentation as well. In this case, we are connecting our user model with our post model. Now the user model comes in by default from Django. So you can actually see this in our settings. We've got user related stuff in here, more specifically the auth. That portion has the user model by default. And of course we have AllAuth, which is using that user model as well, which is really nice. So in order for us to reference this, what we end up doing for us to connect it is we do from django.conf, we're going to import our settings module, and then we're going to go ahead and say the user equals to settings.auth user model. Now the reason we use this is because you can actually change the default Django user model. It's a little bit more advanced than what we're covering here, but the idea is we want to reference this. This is actually just a string to auth.user, something like that, but that you could actually print it out to see what the default value is for that user model as well, which we'll see in just a moment. So once we have this, we also want to decide what happens to all of these posts if the user is deleted. So if the user that's being referenced or connected to any given post, what happens to all of their posts if that user is deleted? So then we would do something like on delete, and in my case, I'll just do models.cascade, which means it's going to delete all of them. It's going to delete all of the posts from a recently deleted user. That's pretty much it. So it basically clears out all of their data. There are other options which you can read about as well. Okay, so this is going to be our post. Then we want to have something like share on LinkedIn, and this is going to be models.boolean field. And the default is going to be false, right? Basically, it's not shared on LinkedIn yet. Then I also want to have shared on LinkedIn, or shared at, let's say shared at LinkedIn. And there's going to be a models.datetime field. And we're going to go ahead and say our default, or we'll say auto now is false, and auto now add is also false. And then I'll explain these two in just a moment. And then I'll also go ahead and say null being true and blank being true. Okay, so auto now add, what is that? That is going to be updated every time this post is going to be saved. So if we actually think of this in terms of a updated at field or updated timestamp, we could say auto now add as true, and then I could remove these other values. If we want to know when this was created, you could do something like created at, and this is going to be auto now add. This will only be set when the post is first created in the database. So these are database values that end up coming through in here. And so I'll talk about these share on LinkedIn and shared at LinkedIn in the near future. But for now, this is going to be my post model in here. So what we do after we design a model is we want to bring it into our installed apps. So we'll go ahead and do internal, and this is going to be posts. So as soon as you add it to installed apps, then Django knows about this model. If you did not add it into installed apps, then Django will not know about this model. And the it here is the entire app itself, this entire module that's in here that's actually designed or defined by apps.py. So we're really adding this portion in here into our installed apps, and then Django knows about it as well. Okay, so that's kind of the general idea here. And then we want to, after we make any changes to models.py, this is true all across the board, you want to run python manage.py, make migrations. And what we've got here is we've got an invalid import. So we'll go ahead and do from django.db. Oops, we got a little typo. This should not say setting, but rather settings. Of course, I used it correct right there. Okay, so let's try that again. Make migrations. All this is doing is saying, hey, database, we're about to make some changes, and I want to keep track of those changes in Python, which is what this initial file does. Is it's basically saying, hey, we're going to do these changes very soon to the database, and then we'll go ahead and run python manage.py migrate. We'll come back to migrations in a little bit, but the idea is now we have the ability to use these models somewhere. Where that somewhere is going to be in the Django admin to start. So inside of admin.py on posts, we'll go ahead and do from .models. We're going to import that post model, and then we'll just do admin.site.register of that post model in here. We'll go ahead and save that, save our models.py, of course. If you didn't have your migrations run, your models.py maybe wasn't actually saved. So let's go ahead and refresh this in here. And now we've got posts in here, and I can add a new post. I can select a user, and I can say something like hello world again from the Django database. Something like that. We hit save and continue editing. We now have our own data stored into our database with our own model. Back into the Django admin, this really helps us design what we might want to have for our user's front end, right? This field of share on LinkedIn is a good example of that. So as soon as I actually select this field and hit save and continue, in theory, I want this to actually send to LinkedIn and then never do it again. So the post only works one time. LinkedIn's API itself won't allow for you to share it multiple times anyway. So the idea here then is once shared on LinkedIn is done, we're done. Now, one other thing, of course, we're going to work towards is being able to schedule this sharing process. Right now, we're just doing it in real time. Eventually, we will do the scheduling and all of that. So the idea is to jump back into models.py and define a method called save. So if we do save and self args and keyword args, and then super.save args and keyword args, this is the function, the built-in function that Django models call every time a model instance is saved. In other words, every time an entry is called save on any of these save and continue, this function will be called for us, this method here. And so this is a pre-save and this is a post-save. So the idea is we can override this save method. We can make changes to it whenever we want to. Now, the important thing about save itself is you basically never want to call self.save. That is going to be a recursive method that will cause an issue, which you could try out to see on your own. But let's take a look at how I want to approach this share on LinkedIn and shared at LinkedIn. The way I want to approach it is basically saying something along the lines of if self.share on LinkedIn, then we'll go ahead and print out sharing on LinkedIn. And then we would then say something along the lines of self.shared at on LinkedIn being equal to something. This being equal is going to be from django.utils. We're going to import something called Timezone, and then I'll do timezone.now. Okay, so that's a way to set this date time field to a timestamp very similar to the updated at and all that, but this also uses the user's time zone as well, or actually the actual time zone for the setting that's inside of Django itself. In other words, it takes time zones into account on this one. So if we were to save it like that, so let's actually take a look now. I'm going to jump back into the admin here. I'm going to select share on LinkedIn, hit save and continue. Notice it saved it. If I hit it again, it will save it again. It will constantly change that value, which is not what I want to have happen. What I want to have happen is it only sets that value one time. In fact, if that value is set, it won't attempt to share it on LinkedIn again. In other words, if we look into the terminal here, we can see that it printed out sharing on LinkedIn. And of course, if you still have the print user statement in here, you would also see that it is auth.user. But the idea here then is we can actually change this a little bit. We can add some logic in here. And so that logic will be another method, a custom method, and something like can share on LinkedIn. And so this one would then be, okay, well, if it already has a timestamp, that means I can't share it on LinkedIn. So basically something along the lines of we would return not self.shared at LinkedIn, right? So then we would then say and self.can share on LinkedIn. Otherwise, we'll print out not sharing, something like that. Okay, so why is it not? Is because it can be null or blank. So that will give us a true value if it's ready. So again, we'll go ahead and hit save and continue. Notice share on LinkedIn is there. We look at our print statement. It is still saying this, and I know why. That's because this is a function, and I did not call that function. If I turn it into a property, then it will not need to be called. So let's try that again. We hit save and continue, and now it's going not sharing. Okay, so we obviously aren't actually sharing any data now, but the idea is if that timestamp is empty, then it can share. So if we come back in here and we remove this like that and hit save and continue, now it sets it and now it's sharing it. If I try to do it again, it will not try to share it at all. Now, of course, we want to get this right so that Django itself is not running into errors attempting to share on LinkedIn ever, but rather having some logic built in so that it prevents it from happening. The other thing about can share on LinkedIn is we could then also check our user to make sure that they even have the capability to share on LinkedIn, which of course is something we'll want to do in the near future as well. Now, the other part about this is this Boolean here is maybe I also don't want it to be true any longer. So right before it goes to save, we can actually turn it into being false because, well, that's basically just a button, essentially a trigger of some kind to attempt to share on LinkedIn. So if I come in here, it's attempting to share it on LinkedIn, in which case it's not sharing. It's already there. It's already shared in all of that. One of the things our save method does not account for is validation errors, as in giving the user a message of some kind saying, hey, you made a mistake. Let's take a look at how to do that now. First and foremost, we're going to import the class of validation error from core exceptions inside of the Django package. Then we're going to implement something called clean, which takes in self args and keyword args. And then we do super clean and args and keyword args. Okay, and so what we have here is we can actually call a validation error on any given field. So let's go ahead and say content and say this is invalid, something like that, raise validation error after it's cleaned. Okay, so going into our post here, I hit save and continue. We see that it says this is invalid. Of course, we don't want that to happen every single time. We only want it to happen sometimes. So for example, if self.content or let's say the length of content is less than 5, then we'll go ahead and say, we'll raise that error and say, this is invalid, or maybe something along the lines of content must be at least 5 characters long, something like that. In which case we could then come down and just do 3 characters and hit save and continue. Hello world, this is cool or good or whatever. Hit save and continue. Great. So that's a good start. So in other words, this clean method is doing those validations for us. So what we want to do then is also have something in here and say something along the lines of elif these items right here, right? Or more specifically, if that and not can share, right? So of course we want to see if it is trying to share it, and if it can't actually share it, this is when we'll then do the validation error and say something like content is already shared on LinkedIn. Simple enough. And then we come back in here, we hit save and continue, and we've got hello world, this is good. Let me go ahead and try to share it again. And now we've got content is already shared on LinkedIn. This is actually the wrong field here. So where did content come from? It came from the field name itself. The share on LinkedIn is actually where this validation error should happen, most likely. We hit save and continue. Now it's happening down here. We could also actually do it in both places, and we can go ahead and say something along the lines of just having two different validations errors in here, so it shows both things being incorrect, which is also definitely a valid option. Now, the reason we use the clean method has to do with the fact that we can use the entire instance itself. There is another way to something like validate, let's say share, and it would take in a value, in which case we could then print out what that value would be. So let's say, for instance, the content one. Let's go ahead and copy this one right here, and I'll go ahead and now call this just simply value, and then this time is going to be the validation error, and we'll go ahead and say something along the lines of content must be longer. Okay, so go ahead and comment this one out for a moment and move this back to being if, and then we can use this validate share directly on the field itself with validators, and this is a list of validation items that you can bring in here. So the length of that value, the value is going to be the field directly, and it's only going to work with that field directly. So let's go ahead and try that one again, and I'll go ahead and just do he, and then we hit save and continue. Content must be longer. But of course, this doesn't give me value to other field items. So you can use either sort of validation method as you see fit, but in our case, I really want to have multiple in there, and I'm only going to really have it on this kind of validation. So me personally, I typically say, if I'm going to use the multiple validations, that's the approach I take versus the field itself. That way I can just look for those validators inside of this clean method in here. Great. So some options for validation inside of a Django model, just to help it be a little bit easier for your end user, what they might want to be. And we could also add in value. So content is already shared on LinkedIn at, and then we could do self.shared at LinkedIn, something along those lines, which gives us even better value. So we hit save and continue. Hello world, this is great. Hit save and continue, and there we go. So now it actually shows you that value. But of course, we still have to actually verify if this user can share, which is super easy. To check and verify that a user has potentially the ability to share to LinkedIn is really to check whether or not they have their social account connected through Django and Django AllAuth, otherwise stored on our database. And we've already done this. So in LinkedIn.py, in our helpers, we have this function called get LinkedIn user details. So let's actually use this function now. The question would really be, where do we use this function? When it comes to the clean method here, we can actually call other methods in here, like this can share on LinkedIn. This one happens to be a property, but inside of here, we can actually verify that user as well. So we're going to go ahead and do from helpers. We're going to import LinkedIn, and then I'll just go ahead and call inside of here. I want to do try LinkedIn dot, and it's going to be our get LinkedIn user details of self.user. Self.user, of course, is going to be the model field value. And then if there is an exception, we can return false, or we can potentially do something else. Let's go ahead and try to raise a validation error in here. Let's see if this actually ends up working, and say something along the lines of user, and this user is not able to share on LinkedIn. Okay, so this is going to be a catch-all exception in here, and of course it still returns false, which probably is not necessary now, but let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to go ahead and create a new post here. with a user I know doesn't have any connection, which is this user. And I'll go ahead and say, hello world, how are you? I'll go ahead and hit share on LinkedIn, hit save and continue. This user is not able to share on LinkedIn. So the other thing is, what is the actual exception? So we can do exception as E. Let's go ahead and print out what that exception is. And then I'll go ahead and say something along the lines of validation error like that. Save it, and we will run that again and take a look at the print statement that comes in with that exception. There it is right there. And so now we can actually come in here and use this exception in general, right? I can come in and do something along those lines, in which case it will now use the other exception that's happening from this connection right here. This is where making your own exceptions might make a whole lot of sense, right? Actually making your own exception classes. So for example, let's say for instance, user not connected LinkedIn, and this would just take in an exception, and in which case we would then say pass here. And now I could actually say something along the lines of raise that value. You could still have that exception coming through. It's basically the same thing, but now back into my models, I can also import or use that one. So let's go back into here and we'll go ahead and say accept, and this will now be LinkedIn dot user not a connected exception, which would allow for me to raise a different one saying something like you must connect LinkedIn first or something like that before sharing to LinkedIn, right? And that's why you might have your own custom exceptions all throughout. So let's go ahead and make sure that we have the correct exception, and let's take a look now. I saved everything, and there we go. So now we've got a different message in here. If I were to comment this out for a moment and save it again, it goes back to that original exception, which either and both are absolutely okay. But of course, if you come back to this and it is connected, like there is a social account, but maybe they no longer are actually connected on the LinkedIn side, something's wrong with the API, you can have a bunch of other exceptions potentially being raised in here, which is outside the scope of this one, but at some point you might work that direction. And so, yeah, having the user exception in here makes things a little bit easier. Now, in my case, I would actually have an entire module dedicated to exceptions, but I just wanted to show you some of the things you might consider doing for this one. Now, this can share on LinkedIn function itself, maybe should be an actual function, not a property here, or like something like verify LinkedIn, share, something along those lines. There's optimizations you can do there. The other thing is that you might want to optimize is this actual lookup method. You might want to cache it for like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that, so that you're not hitting the database a bunch of times just to do a few shares on LinkedIn. It's not necessary, but it will become necessary when you have a lot of users. With just a few users, it's not that big of a deal. Even thousands of users is probably not that big of a deal because production grade databases are getting faster and faster, which means that doing these multiple lookups is not as expensive as it once was. But that is something you can consider in terms of an optimization for this portion. Now that we've validated everything, let's actually build a method to post it to LinkedIn. So actually sharing to LinkedIn is a very straightforward process. First off, we've already imported the LinkedIn helper module, which has post to LinkedIn. So at this point, we now have the save method here that we could call and LinkedIn.post to LinkedIn of self.user and self.content. Both things are available right inside of here. Now in this save method, we might actually run into an exception for that. So we want to handle that, and I'll just go ahead and say accept. And then this would be raise validation error. And in this case, we would say something like content, and we would do our could not share to LinkedIn. So this might be another place where we use the actual text that are in the exceptions here, something along the lines of invalid post, and this is where we can build out more exceptions in there as well. But at this point, we now have the way to share it. And of course, if the exception is raised, that means that this won't ever be touched. Like it won't ever go there in terms of actually, posting to LinkedIn. So let's go ahead and try this out. First off, if I use the wrong user, it's going to go ahead and do that. If I use the correct user, I can do hello world. This is a new post via the database. Notice I'm logged in as that other user. I'm not logged in. I'm actually just selecting that other user. I get save and continue. And in theory, this posted to LinkedIn. I would have to verify this by actually going to LinkedIn, refreshing on my homepage, and then going into my posts here. And there it is right there. That just happened. So once again, I'll go ahead and delete this post because I actually don't want it at this point. I want to rethink my validation based off of the platform itself versus something that's more general or generic. So basically what I want to do here is I'm going to take this property of can share on LinkedIn and now go ahead and say verify can share on LinkedIn, and that's it, where I run validations in here, validation errors altogether. So basically we would then go ahead and say if it's already shared on LinkedIn, then we would want to bring that one up, right? So let's go ahead and bring the raise validation error right there, right? So same validation error that I had before, then I actually am going to go ahead and do that one. That's going to be the first thing. If it's already on LinkedIn, we're not even going to attempt to do anything else. I now no longer need this return statement. So basically all this is doing is run validation errors if attempting to share on LinkedIn. That's it. That's essentially what I want to do. And so the next one would be something along the lines of the content itself. Once again, if we wanted the content to be a certain length, that might be the first validation error that I go ahead and do as well. And so there we go. So now I've got all of the LinkedIn-based validations that are on here that I would run if I'm attempting to share on LinkedIn. Which means that then in my clean method, all I would want to do then is remove these and say something along the lines of if self.share on LinkedIn, then we want to run that function, which will do all of those validations. This could also happen inside of the save method, but it's probably not necessary at this point. The main thing is if on share on LinkedIn, we would want to make sure that that's always going to be false, which it is. So when we start to share it, we always want to make sure that we are stopping share it as well. And so now I probably don't need this can share on LinkedIn method at all or property at all because of my validations that are coming through. And now it's a little bit better in terms of what we might do in terms of sharing on LinkedIn. Now, you might also want to create a whole nother model specifically for all of the different platforms that would keep track of the sharing for any given post, because at some point you might want to reshare that content, maybe with new data or something along those lines. But overall, we now have a way to, I think it's a little bit cleaner to verify it this way, where we now have a bunch of steps on what we need to do to verify this data before we attempt to share it. And so we'll go ahead and save that. Now I no longer need this post in here at all. In fact, I can also put this share on LinkedIn right after the Boolean goes through right up there on the save method. Now it's important to note that clean happens before save. So now it's going to go ahead and run the save method, right? Pre-save is after that as well. That's the entire save method. So pre and post save, something along those lines. Just an important thing to note. Now, of course, we want to verify this. So let's go ahead and jump into the admin again. And I'll now create another post here for Justin, for my LinkedIn user. So posting to LinkedIn with better validation, share on LinkedIn, save and continue. Verify share on LinkedIn is not defined. I think I have an issue, and that is I did not call self.verify can share on LinkedIn. Great, let's try that again. There it went. It went ahead and shared it. I'm going to try to share it again. Now it's saying that it was already shared. I go back into LinkedIn just to verify that it was shared, which I think it did, and there we go. And once again, I'll go ahead and delete that post. And so now we are there. So this is much cleaner, so that now if we wanted to have additional sharing options, we totally could do that. Now, one other thing, what I would probably end up doing is something like define perform share on LinkedIn of self and do this portion just like that. And then I'll also go ahead and say something along the lines of save being false. And then we'll go ahead and say if save, then we would do self.save. And we can return self. Okay, and so now we can try and call this one, perform share on LinkedIn, which I believe will set all of those things. If for some reason it's not, we can just say self equals to that, which will then update all of those values. And we'll go ahead and say save equals to false. That way we don't have a recurring save going on. And this way it's now showing us perform and verify. Now this is another place where these can be removed from models.py now as different modules altogether, which is not something I'm going to do, mostly to keep things as simple as possible and keep the logic in one place to make it as simple as possible. But let's go ahead and try that one more time. So once again, I will go into posts, new post here, and we'll go ahead and say, hello world, this is working. Share on LinkedIn, save and continue. Looks like it worked. Refresh on my LinkedIn and scroll on down to the post and hello world, this is working. Sure enough, it is. And we are now in a good spot to continue going and start actually scheduling some of this stuff out. The Django admin is a powerful way to prototype all of the features we might want to build on a front end for our Django project. At this point, let's take a look at the Django admin on how we can modify a few things to make it far more effective. First and foremost, we're going to go ahead and create post admin, and it's going to be admin.model admin. And we'll just go ahead and say pass for a moment, and we'll bring this into register. Now there is another way to register the admin class itself, which is something you can look at in the documentation. But the idea here is we want to be able to adjust what is being shown on the post itself. So let's go ahead and do something called list display here. And we can actually bring in the post itself. So we could say user and maybe content and maybe even shared at time. So shared at LinkedIn, or maybe let's just do updated at. Okay, so there's our new list display. And if I were to refresh in here, I can now see all of these different things, right? And so in the case of our user here, we might want to just have content. Maybe we just show content because it's going to be that specific user. And that's maybe what we would end up wanting to see. Now, what I can also do here is I could do something called define get list display, which it takes in self, request, and then args and keyword args. And now we could say something like if request.user is super user, then I can return back something different where it's going to be user, content, and updated at. Otherwise, the default would be what our original default was, in which case I can now comment out this list display and refresh in here. And now, as the super user, I can see the actual users that are in here as well. And maybe I want to reorganize these a little bit. There's a lot of different options on how you could go about doing this. You can also do something called list filter, which would be something like updated at, and we can refresh in there, which gives us this filter on the side. There's a lot more things that you can do with this altogether, but overall what we've got here now is a way to sort of better manage our content. You also might have a user in here, which you'd want to be careful about using the user, mostly because if you have thousands of users or millions of users, this will become incredibly inefficient. So it's not necessarily something you're going to want to do. But there's a lot more things you could do within the list display. So this right here is basically all of the rows that are being stored in your database. I mentioned that before, that when you actually created the model itself is you define the columns that are being stored, and then every time you put a new entry, that's going to be a new row, which is what's being shown right here in this list display. So again, this is a really good showcase of what you could do with your Django front end if you wanted to build something out. In our case, we're going to be using everything through the admin for the most part, with some few exceptions. But overall, here's the idea. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we want to actually go into the content itself and change how this works. So regardless of the user that's accessing this content, I want to change something called get read only fields and this takes in self, request, and the object. So obj, and I'll do args and keyword args. Now, what is the object? Let's go ahead and print out what the object is, and I'll return an empty list for a moment in terms of the read-only fields. So if we go into our terminal that's running our Django project here, we will be able to see what the object is. If I refresh in here, it should show post object 4, and sure enough, there it is. So in other words, I can actually use the request. So the requested user was the super user or the user that's logged in. Now I can also see the object that's available on any given instance, right? And so basically what I would want to do then is we would want to say something along the lines of if obj dot, let's say for instance, we'll jump into the shared at LinkedIn. So if that's true, then the read-only fields we'd want is probably content. It's also probably going to be shared at LinkedIn and maybe even share on LinkedIn. Okay, as soon as I do that, I refresh in here. Now it's showing me these are now read-only fields. I also probably want to make sure that the user is read-only as well, so that that's not showing up either. So you can't actually make any changes to it, to the field that was already finished. This is important to also say if the obj even exists, so that then when we actually go to create a new post, we don't run into an error, because these should not be read-only except for probably shared at LinkedIn. So that one is almost certainly going to be a read-only field. Okay. The other thing is maybe our user field would be read-only for the user itself. So we'll see that in just a moment, but the idea here is basically something along the lines of if request.user.is superuser, then we'll go ahead and return this as our read-only. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and return user and shared at, just like that. Great. So I refresh in here, everything looks the same. So I'm going to grant access to my other user, this user right here. If I try to go into the admin, it shows me who I'm authenticated as, but I don't have access to go into the admin. So to grant access, we can just go into that user here in the admin and select staff status. Do not select super user status unless you want to give them all permissions. Staff status means that we design or define what permissions this user can have. I'll go ahead and save that. Now, if I refresh in the admin on the other user, I can see that I don't have permission to do anything. So let's give them permission to do something. Inside of here, I'm now going to go into user permissions. I'm going to search for post. Here are all the things I want to allow for this user to do to see their posts. I save that, I refresh in here, and now I can see all of these different posts in here. I go to add posts, all I can do is content in here. But unfortunately, the downside of this is it actually does show all posts, which we can verify by creating a post with my other user. Let's go ahead and say, this is my JMitch user, and we'll say new post here, Justin user should not be able to edit. We hit save, and there we go. I didn't even attempt to share it on LinkedIn because I can't. You must be connected, right? But the actual post itself is going to be on here. I didn't share it, but there it is. So if I go back into the admin again on the other side, it now shows the other user. This is not what we want to see whatsoever, right? So how do we actually change this one then? Well, this is just a slightly different field, and it's called something called get QuerySet, and this takes in self and request. So the user is going to be the requested user. And this is provided once the user is logged in. This is provided on every view that's out there. The post model admin is a view itself. And so what I can do is I can get the original query set, which is going to be super, and it's going to be get query set of the request that is calling this same exact method, the default one. And then we'll go ahead and say something like if request.user.is superuser, then we'll just go ahead and return that query set, which kind of makes sense. Otherwise, what we can do is we can return back QuerySet.filter user equals to request.user, right? And so that's going to be our query set, and the user that we're filtering down is this one right here. And this is how you do one of those query set filters. So now back into the admin here, if I refresh, I see that there's only 5 posts. That other one that I was just looking at, I no longer have permission to take a look at. So if we go in here and copy the URL and paste that in, it says it does not exist. Perhaps it was deleted. It does exist, it just doesn't, this user does not have permission to actually see it, which is what's going on with this query set. This is not the only way to do it, but it is a nice way to do it altogether. Okay, so the next thing would be actually being able to delete these posts, right? So if this has been shared on LinkedIn, then we want to prevent the delete process from happening. So here's the one that's been shared on LinkedIn. I want to prevent that delete here. And the way we do that is another method called hasDeletePermission. Takes in self request, the object again, which we can leave in as none because that's actually the default. And then we can do args and keyword args. So the first thing is, if it's the super user, we'll do request.user.is super user. We'll just go ahead and return true. And then if obj is none, then we'll return false. The final one would just basically check if obj.user, as in is the post user, equal to the request.user, and not obj.shared at LinkedIn, that field right here. So that would give us the ability to delete any given post. I refresh in here, I can't delete this one. This was shared on LinkedIn. This is going to be forever stored on the database until the user itself is deleted. The draft, on the other hand, which is not shared on LinkedIn, is there. And this one I could delete. I can also add new post here. And well, we hit save and continue, I get this problem. This problem is related to the fact that our user is read-only, right? It's a read-only field all across the board. So the way we set this user is we can do something called save model, which takes in self, request, obj, form, change. And then we're going to go ahead and do super.save model by default. And it's going to be request, obj, form, change. Not doing much here other than if not change, as in the instance did not change, the object no change, aka being created. Then we'll go ahead and do obj.user equals to the request.user. And that way, it's always going to be the user that's logged in will have their own posts. So another test here, hit save and continue. There's that read-only user, which at this point, we don't even need to show that field, but I'm keeping that field in there just to show that this thing is working. So we can go to each one and we can see that that is actually the correct user in here. And then if I were to jump back into the admin user, now I should be able to see these other ones as well. And it looks like I can. I've got my JMitch user here and then also the Justin user. So both things are on here. And at this point too, I can also probably change this user as well. So let's go ahead and do one slight change to this save model. And basically something along the lines of if not obj.user, something like that. Let's go ahead and save that one now. And so I'll go ahead and say, Justin, another draft for you. Hit save and continue. There's that other draft. If I did not do that one, we could try that again and do another draft for me. Trying with Justin, save, it automatically changes it. So this is just like overriding the save model right here, but it's happening just in the post admin form altogether, which this is necessary because of the request. The model itself does not have access to that request, only the post model admin does. So there's a lot more that we could do with the admin itself. Like I mentioned before, feel free to look at the documentation. But this right here will be really helpful for us when we now try to use our LinkedIn logged in user, not just a super user all of the time inside of the admin, so we can actually prototype all of the scheduling and all that. We're going to now start the process of integrating Inngest with Django. Now, Django itself is great at many things. One of the things it's not good at is later. Like, how do you run a function later? How do you update a database entry later? How do you schedule a LinkedIn post to be released at a certain date. All of those things will be solved by integrating Inngest with Django. So Inngest itself is a service that we can use to send a small piece of data with some additional information about that data, like, hey, run it on October 3rd or something like that. That piece of data can go sent to our Inngest server, which will then eventually send it back to our Django project so that our Django project can handle things as necessary. So if we look at Django, what Django does really well is we can actually respond to requests from a user. The user's logged in and they do a bunch of stuff. This is what web applications are really good at. They're made to respond to user requests. What they were never made for was to process things in the background, to send them later. For that, you often need other services. Now, traditionally speaking, with Django, you might spin up another application called Celery. Celery itself needs its own server to run in conjunction with a Django server. So you would have two servers running just to have background tasks. If you want to also schedule tasks to run in the background, you might need another server. That would mean 3 servers just to post one thing to LinkedIn in 3 months. That's not exactly what we want to do. Not to mention you'll need something like Redis to actually organize a bunch of those things for us. So instead what we want to do is we want to use Inngest, because we just send a little packet of data to Inngest. Inngest will hang on to that for us and then send it back to our Django project, not to Celery, but specifically to Django, and then it will actually run that function as we design it. It's a really straightforward process, as we'll see very, very soon. Another advantage of using Inngest is it will actually retry failed functions. It will do it over a certain number of times. You can also do throttling. So if you have a really popular system, you can throttle the requests so that they're not overloading any sort of API request either, like to LinkedIn. Sometimes you might be throttled there. Sometimes you might fail. Sometimes the internet might go down or whatever. There's a lot of different things that could happen that Inngest will help us solve these problems that just don't come native with trying to integrate something like Celery. Not to mention the headache of running Celery on a regular basis is a whole nother ballgame that's not exactly as easy as running Django on a regular basis. Django you can also deploy to serverless and still use Inngest. In fact, that would be what I recommend you do. You deploy Django to a serverless function of some kind so that it can run when it needs to, and then Inngest will coordinate with that. That's actually what it's really well suited for. Now, there's many other things that you can do, like building out pipelines where it's like a bunch of functions happening in one spot. We'll see a lot of those integrations in the very near future. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and start the development process on our local machine. And to do that, we're going to be using Docker, the Docker version of Inngest. This is going to be our local version that we'll develop with. And it's, of course, all open source, so we can actually build on top of it and see how all of this works before we ever go into production. Let's take a look. Before we integrate anything with Django, let's go ahead and get the development server for Inngest up and running on our local machine. Now, there's a few different ways on how you can go about doing this. If you go to inngest.com/docs and click on any of the Quickstart guides, like let's say, for instance, Next.js, and look for the run the Inngest dev server function, you can see there's a few different ways on how you can download and install running the Inngest server. Now, in our case, we are using Python, and Python has a couple ways as well. One is using npx in this way. Notice that it has a very specific URL. This is going to be very important later. And then also there is the Docker version. I'm going to be using the Docker version. And in fact, I even made a Docker Compose file here that already has all of that stuff up and going that you can jump on GitHub, grab that Docker Compose file, and run it in just a moment. I'm going to show you how to bring it up and bring it down with Docker. That's the only thing. I've done a lot of different stuff with Docker, so let me know if you need some more information on that. But the idea here is you go to docker.com, just download Docker Desktop. Once you have Docker Desktop up and running, you will see something like this. That's what you need to have so that then you could jump into your local project where you have that compose.yaml file, this right here, and then you can run Docker compose up and hit enter. this will create that server. And then when you want to take it down, you can just go in that root again and do docker compose down-v. That will take it down. There's a lot more to Docker than just that, but this compose.yaml just makes it really easy to bring up and bring things down. I also have this referenced in rav.yaml. Those two files are the actual run commands themselves if you need to do that and you don't really want the full-on Docker refresher. So at this point though, I'm going to go ahead and leave it in as docker compose up and just leave that running going forward. So I have my Django server running and my Docker server running, or the actual ingest schedule server, the ingest development server running as well, which is all of this right here. So we're not touching anything outside of our computer as it relates to Python and also Django and of course ingest. All of this is happening on our local computer, which is super nice. Now, one of the key things here is this URL right here. Notice that it says port 8000 and then API/ingest. These things are all default to what we'll end up doing with Django. If you end up using one of the other methods, you will also see the port of 8000. If for some reason you're not running Django on the port of 8000, you're going to want to make sure you change that piece. The API/ingest, that's something we'll design very, very soon. Now, if you were to try to open this right now, you'll get this site can't be reached, right? This is because of how Docker ends up working. But the idea here is if we go to our local host at 8000, we should see a page not found at this point. But what we should also see is the actual ingest server running at the other port, which is 8288. So if I were to replace all that with 8288, I should see this right here. Now, there's certainly a chance that your ingest development server looks slightly different than this, but the idea here is this is where we're going to send our messages from Django to this local version of ingest, and then we'll be able to monitor everything that's going on, including being able to invoke functions right inside of this server. We will be able to run something specific inside of that. So I want to see how that's done. But of course, that means we now need to configure Django to actually work with ingest. Back into the ingest Quickstart for Python, we're going to go and scroll on down and see a few familiar things. That is going to be our virtual environment activation, a pip install of a few different packages we're not using. One of them we need to use, so we'll go ahead and copy the ingest Python library and go ahead and bring it into our requirements.txt. Now, what you'll end up seeing for ingest itself is it does support FastAPI, Django, and Flask. And in fact, it's going to be very similar across all of those. It's just a slight variation for each one, as you'll see too. The reason that's nice is that at some point, if you wanted to switch to one of those other tools, it's going to be basically the exact same thing, less the Django functions that you might end up using. So that's pretty cool. So the next part is we need to do the adding of ingest. So we build out a client, a function, and then we are going to go ahead and route ingest with Django into the URLs themselves. So the example that we've got here is actually great if we were using FastAPI. We are not using FastAPI, so we're going to change it just a little bit. Now, the way I'm going to do this is by creating a module for my scheduler. So inside of SRC here, I'm going to create something called scheduler, and then we'll go ahead and do an init file here. And then I'm going to go ahead and create my client.py. So what I want to do here is I'm going to go ahead and copy a few lines in here from ingest, which is really going to be, well, just ingest itself. And we do not need FastAPI, so it's going to be just this. And we'll go ahead and call this app ID our social, we'll just call it social share. And the logger would be something like gunicorn. We don't really need to worry about the logger at this point because we're not going to be using it a whole lot. But the idea is we now have some sort of client application. So the reason I've got this is because eventually we need to serve this endpoint with a function. So let's go ahead and actually create a function. So inside of our schedule here, I'm going to go ahead and do functions.py. Now, these are going to be the functions that we will want to use later. So if we want to say, schedule our LinkedIn post later, we will be able to do that. That's the point. So I'm going to go ahead and copy their example here. I'm going to copy the whole thing and paste it in. We already have our client, and I don't need fast API, so I can get rid of those two things. I also might not need logging at this point. I'll just import ingest, and then I'll go ahead and do from .client import our ingest client, right? And so I'm doing this as a very Django approach to handling something like this. That is, I'm building out an entire module that has very separate components, like our client just exists by itself. Our functions exist by themselves, and eventually our views will exist by themselves as well. Realistically, one view. But in our function, this is what we're going to end up calling it. I'm going to leave it in as just simply my function to basically go off of their example so we can see what that looks like. The nice thing about using Django is you can use the asynchronous function or asynchronous function. This probably works with Fast API as well, but it's completely up to you on how you approach this. I'm going to be using synchronous functions going forward. The point here, though, is we are creating a decorator with a function ID. This, of course, is specifically for ingest. We have a trigger in here, which we'll see very soon. And then we've got stuff related to this data, what's happening with any given event. Again, this is a lot of new stuff that we'll take a look at here shortly once it's all wired up correctly. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to actually serve this project. So the way we do that is we're going to import ingest, and then we're going to go ahead and import ingest.django. And so what this is going to do is we're going to go ahead and create our scheduler ingest view path. And this is going to be our ingest.django.serve. And it's going to take in our client. So it's going to be from .client. We're going to go ahead and import our ingest client here. And then we're going to go ahead and do from .functions. We're going to go ahead and import the functions we want to serve, which is going to be my function here. Notice that it's named the same thing a few times, but we would need to import the actual Python function itself to bring it in. So the way we serve it is the same way as what we see down here, or at least very similar to what we see down here. So the way we actually could also diagnose this is by going and taking a look at the code directly. This is how I did it. So I went into the code after I installed ingest, and I don't know if I installed it. So let's go ahead and install it into our virtual environment. So we'll do source venv bin/activate pip install -r requirements.txt. Go ahead and run that. And then at some point there's ingest right there. And here's Django right here. And so if we actually take a look, we can see a bunch of things related to Django. We've got our client and our functions, and then things related to our path. I shouldn't have to change those at all, but the point here is it returns a Django URL pattern. It's a little bit different than what Fast API does, so that's why I'm pointing it out specifically in the code. So back to here, we've got ingest Django serve, and it starts off with the client itself, and then the functions we want to use, which will be a list of functions. We'll just leave it like that. Okay, so how do I actually use this portion now? What I need to do is I need to go into CFE home, into my URLs. I'm going to go ahead and do from scheduler. This is going to be scheduler.views. We're going to import this view path, and we'll go ahead and do URL patterns plus equals to an empty list that includes this view path here. So as soon as I save that, my Django project should probably get an error like this. It says signing key missing error, right? So if we actually were to look in that, let's go ahead and do an ingest signing key missing error. This is because we aren't ready for production. So there's a lot of things that local development that you would need to do. One in particular is this environment variable. So one of the things I can do here then is I can actually jump into my Django project where manage.py is, and I can set that environment variable. In the long run, this is not what I would want to do, but in the short run, we will keep it like this, just so that when I'm running Python manage.py, it actually assumes that it's the ingest development server, and that's it. So normally in production, you won't run Python manage.py anyway. So this, I think we're pretty safe with setting in terms of our Django project and that specific environment variable. So now that we've got that setting, we get a new error from Django, which is about this host header. So Inngest is trying to connect with Django, and as you may be aware, Django has some security built in that won't allow for that just out of the box. So you need to go into allowed hosts and add in that host right there. As soon as you do that, then you should be able to verify that your project is connected. Your Django project is connected to Inngest. And the way we can verify this is by opening up our Inngest server in here, refreshing, and eventually we should see apps coming through in here. And so right now it's still giving us that invalid host header. So what I'm going to do is just allow all. And I think that will allow for us in our development mode to be able to have that working. And then I can also check API ingest and make sure that that's working. It looks like everything's looking good in terms of that. But let's go ahead and refresh on our development server. There it is now. So if we see apps, there's our social share. I just had to do a couple things to make sure that that's working. Now in production, or realistically in development, you would probably say something along the lines of if debug, then you would add that as your allowed host, basically saying, hey, Django, if you're in development mode, go ahead and just allow all hosts for this. Otherwise, we would actually be very explicit as to what hosts we want to use. So feel free to select that as is. This is not meant to be full-on production Django ready, but it is meant to allow for us to see how we can integrate with Inngest during our development. Okay, so there's one last thing I want to take a look at, and that is actually using the Inngest development server. So opening up localhost at 8288, we're going to go into the functions here. I'm going to click on it, click on Invoke. I'm going to pass in some data, and I'll go ahead and pass in this data as a JSON string, and it's just going to be hello world. Notice that if I make a mistake in here, it actually does have an editor right built in, which is really nice for doing these kinds of invocations. So let's go ahead and invoke this function now. It seemingly invoked it. And what we've got here is seemingly some sort of invocation that's happened. Let's go back into our function, and instead of just using logger, I'm going to go ahead and just print out the context event. Let's go ahead and see what that does now. So I'm going to go ahead and select this again. I'm going to invoke the same exact thing, run it again. There it goes. It went and completed. Now if I look at my print statement, this is what came through. All of this data in here related to that event. So it's actually really nice. There's a lot of different things that we can do with just this portion right here. So going forward, what we need to learn is how to invoke this with our own code. Let's see how that's done. It's really simple. It's nice that I can use the Inngest development server to invoke a function, to run a function. But what I want to do now is I want to use code to do so. It's a little bit different than what you would do with a normal function. Like you're not going to just call the Python function directly, but instead you're going to trigger an event. Now the reason this is nice we'll come to see in just a moment, but let's first start to invoke this function through Jupyter. So the way I'm going to do this is by using rav. So if you do cat rav.yaml, you will see the function for notebook, in which case I'll do rav run notebook. And this of course should open our Jupyter notebook server. I'm going to go ahead and open the notebook folder, and then I will duplicate the hello world and open that up. This one is going to be 5, and we'll call this trigger ingest function. Okay, we'll leave the setup and I'll get rid of everything else. Okay, so we've got our setup function. Now I want to go ahead and call or import the ingest client. So the way we do that is from scheduler.client, we're going to import our ingest client, and then we're also going to import ingest directly. Great. Okay, so both of those things should import just fine. So there's two things that we're doing here. Number one, we need to define an event object, and then we need to send that event to ingest. So we can do it in two ways, or we could just do it in one single command, which is what we'll end up doing. So we do ingest client dot send, and then in here, we're going to go ahead and do ingest dot event, and then name the event, like some name, and then we can pass in data. So we can pass in a data dictionary here, something like ABC, and that's 1, 2, 3. Okay. So right now, what this would end up doing is sending an event called some name. but we don't have any functions that are listening for that event. We have one single function, and that single function is listening for this event, app/my_function. So that's what we'd have to call in order for that event to work correctly. Now, this is the asynchronous version of sending that event. There is also a synchronous version that you can use as well, and that's called send sync, in which case you would do it something like that. So Jupyter notebooks can run asynchronous code directly in line as well as synchronous code because that's how it's designed. But nevertheless, I want to go ahead and try and run this. As soon as I do, I get this error, event key unspecified. So what's actually happening here? Well, this actually has everything to do with what Jupyter is and what it isn't, and how well integrated it is with our Django project, which is not super well. Now, this would be mostly solved if we just used a .env file, in which case we would have ingest dev in here being 1. But of course, I didn't actually create one of those. I never did, and I don't intend to, because I really want my local code to just work correctly in development mode without relying on environment variables to be set up correctly. So inside of the notebooks here, I'm going to go ahead and grab this function right here, and I'll go ahead and do ingest dev and just change that to a 1. This is a new setup process now, specifically for our Django integration into Jupyter. So I'm going to go ahead and try this again. This time when I run it, it may or may not work. I might need to actually restart the kernel. Let's go ahead and try that out and make sure that this is saved as well. And then we're going to go ahead and run that again. This time it did run it, and I can do it 2 times. Notice that we get this little ID back from when we call that. That, of course, is the event that's being sent, and that's the ID for it. And of course, now if we look into our terminal for our normal Django project, we can see both of those events went through. And of course, we could do it again just to check. So checking 1, 2, 3, or 4, whatever. I can see it. It happens almost exactly when I run it, right? But it's going through ingest. So it's definitely delayed, but Django is still handling that function. And that's exactly how it ends up working, is we're able to run it that way. So what I want to do now is create another function. I'll call this my another func, and we'll just rename it to another func. It'll listen to the exact same event. So we'll go ahead and say event again with that same context. Now I have this other function that I want to use. I'm going to go ahead and import the Python function name into my view, where I would then actually bring it in to be handled. And there we go. So I can go ahead and save this, and we will probably not even need to restart the kernel. We just need to save Django, so Django's updated with all these different functions, and then I can run it again, and what we would end up seeing is there's the event again, and also the original event. So both things are happening simultaneously. So in other words, we're broadcasting this event with the data that's associated to it, which means that any other function inside of our defined ingest functions can listen to that event and do something with it. This is huge because that means that we don't have to spend too much time on one single function getting it right. And if we need to update something about that event, we can just add a new function for it. Now, of course, you could get into trouble there because if you're doing the same thing in multiple functions, then yeah, you might have some issues. But the nice thing here is we can have very dedicated functions for very specific events. And I believe there's multiple ways to have a bunch of different events in there as well, which is also super cool. But now that we can trigger these things with Jupyter, let's take a look at how we can trigger that within Django itself and how it actually makes sense with what we're trying to do, which is, of course, scheduling out our posts. We're now going to create a function to handle the event when LinkedIn posts are scheduled. So the way we're going to do this first is really just handling when any post is just saved, and we can just work based off of that to then build on top of it to make it more robust. So what I'm going to do here is just focus in on one single function, and I'll go ahead and do this as post scheduled or something like that. Or let's call this post scheduler, and we'll go ahead and put that in there as post scheduler for the function itself. Next, we need to think of a good event name for this. Now, if you actually go into the ingest documentation, it gives you some ideas as to how you might want to go about naming this. In my case, I'm going to name it similar to how it's designed in Django, which is our post app, and then our post model, and then I'll do .scheduled or something like that. Now, I could make it even more verbose by actually putting in linked in here as well. So there's some caveats as to why I might not want to do that in the future, but for now, I'll leave it in as just simply post scheduled, and we'll see what this looks like inside of Django itself. Now, of course, we got rid of our old functions in there, so we need to go into our views here, and we're going to go ahead and import this new post scheduler view, and then I'll go ahead and create something like active ingest functions, and then I'll just go ahead and make a list here for those active functions, just so that we make sure that we are actually distinguishing which ones we actually want to use and which ones we don't. Now, before I go much further, what I want to actually verify here is that those old events, like what happens to them if they go away. I'm going to go ahead and run my server again, and then I also want to go ahead and make sure that my Jupyter Notebook is still working, as well as my scheduler server. So inside that Jupyter Notebook that we just went over, I go ahead and send those functions, and they seem to be working. As far as ingest is concerned, they are working. Our Django project is just not listening for these events. So if we look into the ingest server, we can see in the events there's a stream of events, and well, these aren't being handled. Now, off the video, I did some other events in here as well that were handled, but the idea here is we now have a way to see various events that may come through or may not come through. So the idea now is this function here. I want to actually call it. And the way we call it, of course, is by using ingest directly. So inside of our post model here, I'm going to go ahead and bring it in with from scheduler.client. We're going to import our ingest client. I'm also going to go ahead and import ingest directly. And so now in my save method here, when it's share on LinkedIn, I'm going to go ahead and comment out the actual sharing process, and we'll just do ingest client dot send sync, send a synchronous message, because this function right here is synchronous as well. Then we'll do ingest.event, and then we will go ahead and name this event something with some data. And so what's the data going to be? First off, the platform itself is LinkedIn, right? So that's what we're attempting to share here. So the platform's LinkedIn, and then we want to bring in the object ID, which would be self.id in theory. But the problem here is there's a chance that this might not work correctly. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab this, paste it in on here, and then I'll go ahead and do something like trigger send being false, and then I'll go ahead and do trigger send being true here, and then we'll just go ahead and say if trigger send, then we'll go ahead and do this. The reason I'm doing this is we're going to print out the object ID up here with self.id. And you'll see why I did it this way. Okay, so this does create a little bit of an issue, which would be we probably want to also bring this back to being false again before it's saved. Okay, so let's go back into the admin, and I'll select a user, and we'll say ABC whatever. So this is a message, and I'll hit share on LinkedIn, hit save, and continue. So we got an event name is empty. Of course, we need to actually declare the name here, which was this same exact name right here from this trigger. So let's go ahead and bring that one in, and then I'll go ahead and refresh in here. We'll go ahead and do another post here. User, we're going to go ahead and make sure that this user is actually able to send something. So I'll go ahead and say about to send something to LinkedIn, and then I'll hit share on LinkedIn, hit save, and continue. Okay, so it didn't actually share it on LinkedIn for a reason, because we didn't actually perform that. So it can be sent again is the point. But the reason I did this print object ID was to show you one of the downsides of trying to design something like this. We've got an object ID of none, and then we've got this data in here that's attempting to do it. So in other words, a lot of the things that we were doing with overriding that save method are no longer valid, because we need to make sure that we have an object ID. Before it's ever created in the database, before it's ever saved for the very first time, we won't have an object ID. which is important. We need to make sure that we do have that. So there's a number of different ways on how we could solve that specifically, but I wanted to show you how this is done inside of the save method, because this might be the way you end up doing it going forward, depending on how you end up wanting to make sure that these things are working. So at this point, then, we would need to update our function to be able to handle the data that's coming through. That is something we'll still have happen in the very near future. But overall, the idea here is we've got this trigger send. We now have a way to use Django and ingest together in line with a standard sort of Django process. Let's take a look at how we can improve this maybe a little bit more. One of the best ways to improve this post model in terms of scheduling an event is to actually have fields that allow us to schedule an event. So what we could do then is we could say something like share now, and this is going to be models.boolean field. We'll give a default of none, and we'll go ahead and say null being true and blank being true. And then we'll also do share at, and this will be models dot, and it's going to be the date time field again, so that it will actually help us decide one of those two things. So basically what I want to do now is say something along the lines of if self.share now is none and self.share at is none, then we will raise a validation error, and it'll say something along the lines of, let's go ahead and say share at, and you must select a time to share or share it now. Something along those lines. Great. So we made some changes to our model, so that means we need to do our migrations. So source ve and v bin/activate, and then we'll go ahead and navigate into our SRC here. We'll run our Python manage.py make migrations, and then Python manage.py migrate. Go ahead and hit enter, and we'll jump back into the admin. Great. So now I've got share now and share at. If I hit save and continue, it's going to tell me I need to select one of those two things. And of course, maybe we want to have that same validation error for both share at and share now. Okay. And there we go. So what this then would do is if one of these things is selected, then we can actually trigger the send. So one of those will be selected. They will actually have the data available to us. We don't need to make any more migrations. Great. So it's very similar to this share on LinkedIn, right? The verify share on LinkedIn should probably still happen in the model admin itself. But the idea is now when I come down here, this trigger send will be based off of is not none or share at is not none. One of those two things will then trigger that share. I no longer care whether or not it says share on LinkedIn. All I really care now is whether or not we should trigger the send, or rather yet schedule post, or let's say do schedule post. And that is now what we'll end up calling it with all of these other things. And then we would actually go ahead and say the scheduled platforms. And in this case, it will go ahead and take in self. And we would want to return a list of those scheduled platforms. In our case, it would just be share on LinkedIn. And so that would be if self.share on LinkedIn. Then we'll go ahead and say, let's do something like platforms equals to an empty list. And then I'll go ahead and do platforms.append and LinkedIn. Scheduled platforms, and then we'll return back the platforms list in here. Okay, and so there we go. So now it actually would have those platforms. At this point, we no longer necessarily need this data in here because it's no longer trying to respond to what's happening right now. It will still attempt to post it to LinkedIn, assuming that certain things about LinkedIn would be available, as in it's not already saved on LinkedIn. So we might need to adjust that as well, as in it's not already shared. So this right here in this post at, we would then also go ahead and say if not self.shared on LinkedIn, or rather we'll go ahead and say if shared on LinkedIn, then we'll just return that. And then in which case it won't actually be shared at this point. Great. So now we've got our do scheduled post here. We no longer need this in here. We no longer need the pre-save or anything like that, because now the function itself is going to handle the next portions, like calling perform share and maybe even calling validate can share, maybe both of those things. The reason I have this one is just an extra step, just making sure that that is also not going to be called or something along those lines. It's not going to accidentally call it, assuming that it's already shared on there. And so now I've got a way to get those platforms on here, and I don't actually need this to be empty any longer, right? It can actually be on there now. And so I'm going to go ahead and say share now being yes, and I'll hit save and continue. Now it should have triggered that function, which would then be post scheduled right here. And so that just happened. We could do it again and hit save and continue, and there it is again. We want to prevent duplicates from happening. First off, with events within Inngest, but also shares. We don't want that to happen multiple times, because some APIs might allow for you to share it multiple times with the same content. The LinkedIn one just so happens doesn't. So let's take a look at what I mean by this. If I come in here and do some content, this is some content, and go ahead and say share now, hit save and continue, what we would end up seeing is that it's saved there, right? And we can look at this, we see its object ID of 22 seems to be shared. If I do it again, we will see that it is triggering that function once again with that same object. So in the last 30 seconds, I did a few of them, right? And they're doing the same exact data. So we want to avoid that. One of the ways we can avoid this is by adding in an ID to the event. And this is actually fairly straightforward. We can just put in an ID in here that's related to this event. So what you could do is you could do something like this, where it's post scheduled dot and then self.id. Now this might not work for an ID, but it makes a lot of logical sense to me that it's based off of the event name as well. Let's go ahead and see if this even works as an ID. We'll hit save and continue, and we look in our function here. Looks like that ID ends up working. And if I were to call it again, it still does have the event happen, but it does not trigger a function in there at all. Great. So that's a really nice way to ensure that we're not scheduling it too many times. Now, another thing that we want to consider doing probably would be to store when it was shared. So we would say something like share complete at, and we would then grab a Boolean in here, or not a Boolean, but a date time object in here. And we could also even do something like share complete at UID, or share complete UID being a UUID field if we wanted to store an ID for it as well, which would make it even better. But for now, we'll just do the date time object here. And so this would have to actually be set somewhere else. But the idea is we would still want to use this, and we can do so when we actually trigger out whether or not it should do that scheduled post. So the way this works then is we would come in and say something along the lines of all, and I'll do all as in a list of items that need to match the criteria. The first one is just this single one. This is going to be one item in that list, which is this right here. So it's either or still. So this has to be true basically for that post to work. And then also the share complete at is none, right? So these, it's either or on here. This is like it's going to share it now or eventually. And then the other one being when it's complete at has to be none as well. So all of those conditions need to be true in order for this post to save. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and make our migrations here. And I'll run python manage.py, make migrations, and then python manage.py migrate. Now, there's probably a number of errors with the Django admin at this point, whether it's within our super user or our non-super user. So just be aware of that. Maybe you've already experienced it, but a number of things in here I want to have read only, and I want to change a number of things, which we'll see in just a little bit. I want to get this portion working first before I change anything in the admin. We're now going to upgrade our ingest function so that it can actually post to LinkedIn as it was made for. So the way we do this is we get the event data itself. So we get event.data, and we're going to go ahead and print out what's coming through in there within any given model. So I'm going to go ahead and go to a new post here and do something along the lines of hello world, are you there? and then I'll go ahead and say share now being yes, and then I'll just go ahead and hit save and add another. Now the reason I'm doing that has to do with what I'm going to be doing in terms of each object ID. So this is the data that's coming through right here. So what I can then do is say object ID equals to ctx.event.data.get the object ID. This will come in as a dictionary value because that's also what we're sending it as. It's basically the same thing here. So that's going to be our object ID. Now I know it's a post model, so I can go ahead and bring that one in with from post.models import post, and then I can actually get that object ID. So now we're going to go ahead and grab the post instance, or let's just call it instance because that's what it would often be referred to as, which is post.objects.get and the ID equaling to this object ID. Now, there's a chance that this simply does not exist any longer depending on if we deleted it or not. I'm just going to go ahead and say try now, and then we would do something like except and post.does not exist. Then I'll return back missing or something along those lines. It's not so much an error, but it's just not there any longer. So now this is when I would want to actually see what the platforms are. So let's go ahead and say share platforms equaling to instance, and then we would go ahead and get our platforms, which I think we just called schedule platforms, which let's go ahead and get schedule platforms, or rather scheduled platforms. And then I'll go ahead and do for platform in share platforms. And then we'll print out the platform and then the object itself, which will grab our user and maybe our actual content up to like, I don't know, 10 items. And we'll just put a string of the content in there up to a little bit. Okay, so basically truncating the content that we're going to be sending to any given shared platform. So let's go ahead and save it now. And let's make sure our terminal's open where we'll be able to see this. And so I'll add another post here and we'll go ahead and say, hello world, how are you today? Share now is going to be yes. And then I'm going to go ahead and do share on LinkedIn. We'll hit save and continue. And now our print statement has LinkedIn, the user, and then some of the text that's coming through in there. Great. So that means then I can actually work off of these shared platforms. What would be probably better for the LinkedIn portion would be basically say something like if LinkedIn in share platforms, in which case now I would then print out or handle LinkedIn. So handle LinkedIn, right? And so that's what we also want to do. Now, another thing that we'd want to do is maybe go into our model here and do something like mock being true. So we'll say mock being true. And then we'll go ahead and say if not mock, then we'll come through here. I'll actually leave this in as false. So we're going to pretend to perform share on LinkedIn. Okay, so now we've got our instance.perform share on LinkedIn, mock being true. Okay, and so what other things would we might want to mark here? That is going to be something like share complete at. So this would be after all of this. I'll also leave this as save being false still. And we'll go ahead and do instance equaling to, and then instance.share complete at equals to timezone.now. Okay, why did I do instance equals to instance? Well, it has to do with what we were doing with our save method anyway, because this perform share on LinkedIn is returning back the instance. So I want to make sure I return it back here as well. So basically always return back the instance so that I can save it somewhere else. Now, I also might want to verify that it can happen, right? So there are exceptions that can happen in here. So let's go ahead and do that with instance.verify can share on there, which would run through all of that stuff. And in which case we would have a try block in here as well, and then run some sort of exception that would happen also. And this would be except exception as E, and in which case I'd just print out the error, and then I would return back problem saving instance. Okay, But then we've got this share complete at there. And then what else would we have? Share at would probably be right now. These two I'll handle in just a moment. But let's go ahead and save this as is. And so now we've got our post scheduler. Let's go ahead and create a brand new post. I'll go ahead and save and add another. And here we go. Share now. Yes. And share on LinkedIn. Save and continue editing. What we end up getting here is we get an internal server error on here. So something in here actually failed on our process. Maybe I didn't save the mock being true and all of that. That's certainly a possibility. The way we can figure that out is by looking in the event scheduler itself, and more specifically into runs. This is actually kind of cool because it's going to show us what happened. And so what it said is it gave us the actual error that happened. Perform share on LinkedIn, got an unexpected keyword, which was of course this one right here, which I just didn't save in time before I actually ran that function, which is why we got that error. So then it tried to do another attempt and it's got another one. Now it's time zone not defined because I didn't bring it in. So we'll go ahead and do that from Django.utils. We'll import time zone, save that, and then we'll come back in here. So what's happening here is it's actually attempting to run these functions even though there were some errors in here, right? I had errors on my actual function, but it's still going to eventually try to actually run this for us. It's just the third attempt does a little bit longer of a delay to make sure that that's working, or that third attempt actually was successful in making sure that this worked. And now I can go back into that object and refresh in here. And what I should see is share complete at being saved, but I forgot to save it. So let's go ahead and save it now. And we can go ahead and try that again by creating yet another piece of content. So we'll go ahead and come in here and hit that and share now, share on LinkedIn, save and continue editing. What we would end up seeing probably really quickly is that it's there and it's working. Okay, so now we've got this function doing a lot of different things in here, which is generally okay. I mean, it's handling it really well. So it looks up our object itself. If that object's not found, then it's just going to say it's missing and can carry on its way. We would then just assume that the user decided that they didn't want to post it any longer before that schedule would happen. That's essentially how we could interrupt the schedule without necessarily needing to stop the scheduled event happening inside of Inngest. And so then we go through all the different platforms, or more specifically handling the LinkedIn one, and then we just call this bottom part as share complete at, and that's it. So all we really need to do is complete the scheduling portion of this so that that part works. There's a couple of different ways on how we can actually schedule an event to happen. One of the ways is to just queue up the event to happen later. Another way is to make the function delay execution. So there's both ways that we can do. So the first one I'm going to take a look at is the event itself. So what I want to do here is we'll say something like time delay, and this will equal to timezone.now plus some sort of time delta. And in this case, I'll do seconds being like 10 seconds. So I need to make sure that I'm importing the time delta from the datetime object. That way we can actually call it. And so the idea here is we've got our time delay. This right here I want to turn into a timestamp with .timestamp. And then we want to multiply that by 1,000 so that it is the integer that it's expected, which is TS, which is going to be the integer of that time delay. Okay, so you might think of this timezone.now as also one of these fields if one of those fields were in there. I just want to do the time delay so I don't have to worry about the fields, but rather just wait for about 10 seconds for this thing to run correctly. So what I want to do then is I want to jump into my runs on Inngest, and I want to change it to maybe like the last minute, or let's do the last 10 minutes, which I might have a few more than you because I did some tests here. But the idea is now, let's go ahead and do another post, and our server is not currently running. Let's see why. Perhaps we forgot a comma somewhere. Yep, it's after data. Let's make sure we add that comma in. And now our server should be running again, which I'll go ahead and hit save and add another. And we'll go ahead and say hello world, some gibberish, and we'll say share now. and share on LinkedIn, and we'll hit save and continue editing. So if we actually take a look at the ingest server, we can see that this event is now queued. It's now waiting to be executed based off of the actual timestamp we gave it, which will be about 10 seconds from now, and there it goes. It happens very, very quickly. And so naturally, we could queue this up for much further into the future, right? Which is definitely something you might consider doing. And so we could go off of this time delay again and basically change this a little bit now, and which would be basically based off of one of these. So that would be if self.share now, then the time delay would be probably not necessary, right? But we could still have it if we wanted to delay just a little bit to allow the user to maybe delete that post. Maybe we delay 45 seconds or something like that, right? Otherwise, we would do something like elif self.share now, or rather share at, then the time delay would be equal to the share at plus, I would do that probably same delta. I mean, why not? And doing everything else the same, basically, which of course we could probably improve this functionality here. But overall now we would have the ability to queue something up, right? And there we go. So let's go ahead and try this again with yet another one. I'll go ahead and grab my user. Here is my awesome user. And this time I'm going to share at now, and I'll do it in about 20 seconds. And let's put that at 40, share on LinkedIn, save and add another. And I got share at is not defined. It looks like maybe I didn't put self.share at. There we go. Let's try that again. Refresh and hit continue. I don't know if that one necessarily queued up, so let's go ahead and do it again. I'll just grab some content here, and we'll go ahead and do share at now. And once again, we will add only a few seconds here. If I can type fast enough, save and continue. We go into ingest. Now I've got 2 queued up here. Maybe they'll be done really soon based off of what my shared at function ended up doing. So we will see if it was about correct. And so this will, of course, run those things, and it will end up eventually having it being complete on here, right? And so that actually, I think, is pretty nice once you actually get down to it. The actual queue itself, it looks like maybe it's taking a little bit longer than I did 45 seconds. That's a good amount of time to delay it, but let's go ahead and see. The first one finished, so the second one should probably be done any moment now. But overall, the idea here now is we have a way to schedule it based off of delaying the event itself. But what if we actually wanted the event to happen right away and then delay inside of the event? This is a whole nother thing that you can do, and it's actually really easy to do as well. I paused it for just a moment just to make sure that that did complete, and sure enough, it did. Okay, great. So let's take a look at how to delay events inside of the actual function itself. The scheduling we just did was about scheduling the event itself. Now, on one hand, you might want to schedule the event in the future. On the other hand, you might want the event to just run right now and then stagger how you schedule out the different posts that you might be doing based off of the platform itself, instead of trying to schedule all of them to run at the same time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of this time delay inside of my event and then just focus in on the function itself. So let's say, for instance, I want the LinkedIn post to be delayed about 30 seconds from the time I actually run the share event itself. So no time delay on the share event, but rather now we're going to go ahead and delay it inside of LinkedIn. The way we do this is with ingest. So ctx.step, and then we can do sleep. We give it some sort of ID. So we'll do LinkedIn sleeper. And then I'll go ahead and put in 30 seconds times 1,000, or rather 30 times 1,000 to give us 30 seconds. And then that will now sleep it. I'm going to go ahead and actually make it sleep more like 7 seconds so it doesn't take too long for us. But the idea here is we can actually run this wherever we need to. And we can also do another one called sleep until, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. But the idea then is we've got our 7 seconds delay timer on here. So let's go ahead and put in some sort of post here. I'm just going to grab some content, and then we'll go ahead and say this, save and continue, go into ingest. what you'll see is it's running and it's going to take that duration, which should be about 7 seconds. And there it goes. So a little over 7 seconds, and we see the sleeper ID in there working just well. So the next one would be the sleeper ID, schedule, something along those lines, which would take in our time zone and then a time delta. So we can go ahead and do from date time, we can import the time delta. And then I can actually use this as far as my, publish date equaling to timezone.now plus that time delta, and we'll do seconds being 7 again, and in which case I can go ahead and put this in right here. The other thing is this other context.sleep, I can use a time delta as well, so I can just use that too, which might be a little bit easier to follow along with. But now we've got this publish date in here that we're using, which of course should come from the object itself, which is probably what you would want to end up doing. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and grab this and create a new post, save and add another, and then we'll go ahead and see how this works. So we go ahead and run it, ingest development, and there we go. So it's going to wait in here for some time, whatever that schedule is, and it's just going to wait for that to finish. And of course, we can do this multiple times, right? So if I came in here and then verified on LinkedIn and then did this sleeper again, we could just go ahead and publish another one. So let's go ahead and do that. And here we go. And save and add another, go into ingest. And so now we would end up, I have the same ID, I think maybe. Let's see, nope, I have 2 different IDs in here that should actually show us that. So the very first one goes, and then the second one goes, and then it will all work out for us. So one of the things you might be concerned about would be oh, well, what happens to this function? Does that mean that it's just this function is going to be blocking for 14 seconds? No, ingest will handle this intelligently to make sure that all the context and state of the function are managed for us so that then the rest of it can just start to work. I haven't seen this break just yet. Obviously, you could try to add a bunch of different things into a function and see if it ends up breaking it. I don't think it will, but the idea here is we can now use our publish date based off of what we did for our share date. So when it comes to our share date then, this would actually benefit greatly from if, self.share now, we could just come in here and say self.share at equals to timezone.now. Maybe we want to have that time delay on there, maybe not. But the idea then is now down here, our scheduling would just be based off of that. So share at just goes to right now if that's toggled altogether. There we go. So let's try that again. I'll change this up a little bit and let's make sure everything's saved, of course. I'm going to go ahead and say share now, share on LinkedIn, save and continue. Notice it saves that timestamp now for us, which will then actually run as need be, which then means in our function here, our publish date would be based off of that object or the instance. We could do something like instance.share at, something along those lines, assuming that that's not none, which it probably won't be. I mean, there's a chance that it could be. So we would then let's go ahead and do this a little bit differently and say that that's going to be our publish date. If self.share, or rather not self, but instance.share at, then we would change it to being that one instead. There we go. That solves that problem a little bit. And maybe we still have that time delta, maybe not. But this would then go through the process of attempting to share it. It's pretty neat. It's a very simple way to schedule things. We pretty much have everything ready to go. There's not a whole lot more that we would have to do the scheduling. Yes, we might be able to make the LinkedIn sharing more advanced, like specific share at for LinkedIn, share at for X, Slack, and so on. You could have very specific timestamps for all of those, and then maybe have a fallback timestamp, which is the original share at. That is definitely something you could do. But of course, I don't have any of the other share platforms at this point. So it's pretty neat. I do think that this method of actually delaying inside of the function along with delaying with inside of the event, both things work really well, and you could pick and choose whichever you want to do for your events. I think actually delaying the event to when you want to publish in general makes a whole lot of sense. And then from there, delaying the individual platform itself. So like you could then have maybe a LinkedIn share time delta. So it's not a date time object, but it's just a time object. So then it adds it to when the share's at, which could be default to 0. But then you could say, 7 hours after the general share at time, or 2 weeks after, or something along those lines, in which case this function then can handle all of that and handle it really easily. If we look at our post scheduler function, we have a potential bug that would happen because of instance.save. So we're going to do a very simple fix for this, and that isn't changing the save method itself, but as a reminder, the save method, every time I call it, it will go through this logic and potentially resend this event over and over and over again. So obviously we have the logic to check whether or not it will share it. So what we want to think about here then is jumping into the function and really just change that this doesn't accidentally trigger the instance save method again. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm actually going to grab a query set for the post object itself. So it's going to be QS equals to post.objects.filter, and the filter is going to be the ID. And then in this filter, now what I'll do is qs.update and share complete at timezone.now. Now this update does not trigger that save method in the same way. Now there is one more thing that we might want to consider in here as it relates to this, and this means something like share start at, right? So we have share complete at and maybe share start at. Like the function has already started, right? That's kind of the idea there. And so in which case I would then need to run my migrations. So we made some changes there to our models. Like always, we run Python and manage.py make migrations, and then Python manage.py migrate. Okay. So then back into our save method here now, we would say the is none, the share complete at is none. And we would probably also want to say, and the start at is none, as it hasn't started yet, right? So both of those things. So either one of these have to be true, both of these have to be true in order for this schedule post to work correctly. And in which case then I go back into this function, and once again, I can get this query set and I can bring it to the top. Now I actually don't need this instance method like this because I don't need to query it 2 times, but rather what I can do is say if not qs.exists, then I would return missing, right? So basically doing the same thing. Otherwise we would do instance equals to qs.first. In which case I now have my instance and my query set, so I can still do the update down here, which also means that I can update the other one, which would be the share start at. And I would want to have this basically triggered right away, even if the LinkedIn portion is shared much, much later, right? And so the key here, of course, is basically making sure that our verify share on LinkedIn doesn't really have anything to do with those timestamps, only mostly the function itself onto how it's being triggered, of course, right? And so that's the idea. And so now we've got those things working out, and that should help prevent a recursive call to this due schedule post. Now, in the long run, the way I would do this for the front end would be to have some sort of dedicated view that the front end would then do the shared logic in general and not have it on the save method with the post. But the save method is really practical if you want to also allow the admin to be able to do it also. And so now there we go. We've got both of these things, and it's looking like we've got a good setup in terms of our post scheduler. We're going to take a look at how we can do background jobs with Inngest. Now, the way I think of this is more in terms of a workflow, where a workflow gets triggered by some sort of event. Hey, we already did that with this function. And then inside of that workflow, there's individual nodes that can do other kind of work. In our case, would be sharing to different social platforms. So let's take a look at how we can do this. First off, we've got our function, we've got our event. The actual workflow itself is already starting. Now, the first part of this workflow is really just updating, hey, it's running, and then it's going to decide what platforms to share on. All of that stuff is good. The next node realistically is actually verifying and sharing on a different platform, on LinkedIn. So this is going to be the node we want to create. The way I'm going to do this to start would be creating just a standard Python function, and I'll do this something like my workflow, and I'll call this share on LinkedIn node. And it's going to take in an instance, and then it's going to go ahead and return something. Okay, so that's what I'm calling this function. Now, the way this works inside of Inngest is really simple. It's very similar to the sleep until, which we do ctx, or the context.step.run. We give it some sort of name. So we'll go ahead and do LinkedIn share workflow step, something like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and use a Lambda function in here so that I can use the instance itself. So I'm going to go ahead and use Lambda and then pass in that instance. So this right here is now a workflow background step. It's a node that's inside of this greater workflow. Now, the reason that we have this is going to be pretty cool, as you'll see in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this right here, and I'm going to bring it on over into my workflow share here. Let's make sure we tab it back so it's working correctly as a function. So there's a couple good things about this. Number one, this is now just Django code, so I can do all kinds of testing on this single function itself, right? This is where maybe inside of my posts, then I do something like services.py, and I actually put this function in there like that, and then I use that as a way to import and all that. That's outside the scope of what I'm trying to do here. I'm going to keep this single function, this node inside of here, but decoupling it is one of the patterns you might want to think about when it comes to workflow functions like this. So really, I'm looking at this function as a way to sort of orchestrate running other smaller functions themselves. And that's what we're doing here. So now that we've got this function, let's go ahead and try it out. And we'll go into our admin here. I'm going to paste in that code. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to select the user. I'll hit share now. I'll go ahead and hit share on LinkedIn, hit save and continue. We'll jump into our ingest server here. This, of course, has that slight delay still because of the publish date trigger here. I'm going to change this to like 3 seconds so in the video it's a little bit faster. But the idea is I now have a problem. It says share platforms is not defined inside of my actual node step function, right? So that means that I need to actually go into that function and fix the problem, which I have this print statement that is looking for those shared platforms, in which of case I don't actually have inside of this function because I did not add it to the Lambda function itself because it just simply wasn't necessary at that step in that background job. We don't need to know what those shared platforms are anymore. We just need to verify, hey, if it's in there, we've got a Boolean, we've got all the logic to share out the workflow into there. And then we can actually go through that. And what we would see is on the final attempt, we would probably see this thing actually be executed, assuming I did it a little bit faster than that. But the reason I wanted to show you that was really to show you that this is what Inngest does really well, is it can take a function that's not working or one of the steps in that function to retry just that portion, keeping all of the context available for us, and then eventually actually running correctly. So realistically, at the end of this, what I would want to do is I would want to return something back to it. So it would say something like this. This would be a false, and down here would be true. And then we can say shared on LinkedIn. And here we would say did not share on LinkedIn, right? And so all of that being the ability to actually give some sort of response in the step output itself, which we could, of course, try again by creating a new post here. Let's go ahead and add another one and just try it out really quick here. This time, I don't think it will take as long to run, and we shouldn't have any errors, unless, of course, I did something that I didn't realize, but there we go. It happened really fast, and now the entire workflows output or functions output is just simply done. That hasn't changed. And then the share one says true and shared on LinkedIn. So the other part about this that's super cool is we can actually see did share and share MSG. We can actually have both of those things in here, and then we could say if did share, then I could do something like ctx.logger.info, LinkedIn worked. And then we could also do an else clause in here, LinkedIn did not work, or something like that. And of course, I could use the result message itself from that step. So in other words, this is where the workflow part goes out, right? So if the did share failed in here, I could run another step that would send me a text message or a phone call saying, hey, your LinkedIn did not share. Make sure you share it. Make sure you go and fix whatever the problem is. And so here's where we're sort of branching out to a whole workflow we can build out specifically for LinkedIn inside of this post scheduler. I can have more steps in here and all that. We introduced a slight bug in how our timing works. So if we go into our function here and we delay our publish date by 10 seconds, that will help show this. Now, I already did this off a video and you could try it out yourself as well. I'm going to show you how to solve it in just a moment. But the idea here is I posted this. When I first saved it, the share at and start at were almost identical. They were basically the same number. But then after the completion happened, the start at went back. It changed what the actual value was. Now, this is because I'm actually executing Timezone.now again. So the way the function is going to work is it's not necessarily keeping the correct context. In other words, I need to turn this into its own node, just like we did with the workflow share in LinkedIn node. So what I'm going to call this is something like get now, and we're going to return back timezone.now. Now, one of the things about when we are returning data back, we need to make sure that it's JSON serializable, just like what we saw with the event itself. So I need to turn this into a timestamp itself, in which case now on my update here, I'll go ahead and do start at, and this is going to be ctx and .steps.run. So just like what we saw down here, or rather step, not steps, step run, and this is going to be workflow start, and this will get the get now function, and we can call it just like that. So this will give me seconds, which means that I need to bring in date time itself, and we will go ahead and do our start at equals to date time dot from timestamp of the start at step itself, the background one. So that will give us our new start at, which we can now put in here. This will store it in context a lot better, but even if this function were rerun, it would still remember back what that step was. It will remember back that node all over again. And I want to do that same thing down here, and we would say something like end at and workflow end, and in which case I would then use that value down here. And so this should now save it all the time. The other one may or may not work, but the idea here, of course, if the function had to be rerun or any part of it had to be rerun, it's going to change what those times are. So it makes a whole lot of sense to have an individual node for them. Now, if you've ever worked with workflows before, it's very often that you will have a node like that that calls the functionality to get whatever that time zone is because of how these distributed workflows might end up working. And so this is a simple way on how you could go about solving it just like that. Okay, so of course we can verify this as well. Do keep in mind I still have a delay of 10 seconds, so this might take a moment. We'll go ahead and bring it in here like this. Share on LinkedIn, save and continue. Now, if I did everything correct, the share start at should show up right here. And so in about 10 seconds, the new one should update with the corrected time for the complete at, and there it is. And so now this is going to consistently work all across the board when we're building out these workflows. The other thing is, if we were to move these to different locations, maybe we would want to have additional steps in there to store additional data. In other words, if I were to decouple this function and make multiple functions, so there's an event for LinkedIn, there's an event for Meta, where there's different functions in there from Inngest that might handle that specific feature, then this workflow start and end might not work the same way. In other words, if you make it not a workflow anymore, but rather a bunch of different functions, then yeah, the end time is going to not work the way you might want it to. But since this is now a workflow, and inside of that workflow, there are actual steps that are going to take some time to actually run, this timing would work correctly, which I think is pretty straightforward. But it wouldn't have been obvious until you actually did create a workflow itself. Then you'd be like, what's going on with my share times? Those are completely wrong. So it's an easy way to fix it just by creating this little function. We now want to get as production ready as possible as it relates to ingest. The way we're going to do this is we're going to use Inngest Cloud and configure it to work with our Django project instead of using the Docker version. Now, the way we do this is really just changing a few environment variables, adding some keys, loading those environment variables, making a slight change to Django itself, and then going from there. Now, I will say I'm also going to be using cloudflare.com specifically for Cloudflare tunnels so that I have my custom domain name working on my local machine. That is another thing that you'll need for production version of Inngest because it needs to be able to send things somewhere that's on the internet, right? It will need to be able to send out the various webhooks or events that are happening in its entire system on the cloud, which we've been doing so far up to this point using just Docker for that. So the way this works then is I need to go into Cloudflare. I need to have my own domain name. So on Cloudflare, you are just going to go through the process of registering a domain name, and then you go through the process of into Zero Trust, into networks, into tunnels, and creating a tunnel. Now, this process I'm not going to cover right now. I've already covered it on my YouTube channel under the HTTPS Everywhere video. It's a fairly straightforward process, but the idea here is once you actually have it up and going, you want to make sure that your public host name is there and synced into your Django project at port 8000 on your local host. After you do that, you're then going to go into settings.py and you're going to make sure that CSRF Trusted Origins has that domain name and Allowed Hosts also has that domain name, which would look something like hungrypie.com in my case, with a dot in front of it. That way, all of that is working and ready to go into production. The next part would be after you have that domain name, assuming that it works, if you go to hungrypie.com/admin, in your case, it would be a different domain name, of course, and then you'd be able to actually access the Django admin itself. So the next part would be actually having something to load in our environment variables, which is python.env. In this case, I went into settings.py and loaded that in. I installed it. I did all of those things off the video because this is really just showing you how simple it is to get this thing ready for production. So once you are able to do that, then all the environment variables will be ready to be set. I'll show you where to set them in just a moment. But do keep in mind, since we actually did not do the environment variables until this point, manage.py also had another one for the ingest development server, in which case now we want to comment that out because on my server, I'm still running python manage.py run server. This is not production ready. This is just development. So Django itself is not production ready. Ingest is or will be very, very soon. So the idea is as soon as you do all that, you're going to want to update your environment variables, which means take down your server. And these are the variables we will end up putting in. So the way we do this is we jump into Inngest Cloud. So I'm on inngest.com into my free account because I haven't reached the limits of my account at all, which in this case is just 2 runs. I think it's a pretty generous free tier, so go check it out on your own. But the idea here is we want to go into apps. You're going to hit sync new app, and you want to go to sync manually because you're going to have the signing key and your app URL. This app URL is really important, which is why I just went over it. You have your own custom domain at API/ingest. Make sure there's no trailing slash there. You don't need one, but then you also need the signing key. They make it really easy to say, oh, look, this is the signing key right here. They're going to paste in, and then you'll just copy what this value is, and then you'll paste that one in. Now, I have this fallback, which we'll see in just a moment, as well as this event key, but you're going to want to save it and make sure that signing key ends up working. You go to hit sync app. Right now, it's saying it could not reach my URL. That's because my server is not running at all. As soon as you hit your server running, you're going to want to check that your actual tunnel domain is still working and is up, and you can access it like I can here, in which case you'll be able to then test it again, hit sync app again. This time, the verification may or may not work correctly. So if it's not working, that's because maybe I did a syncing after the fact and I have some fallback keys, and there's some issues with my keys so far because I did a bunch of tests that you may or may not have. So to change or roll the keys, which you'll want to do on a regular basis, is to go into your signing keys here, and you're going to want to update them. So right now I only have one key here, and this might be the correct key, it might not be. So if I put it in and save it, that should be my signing key. So now I should be able to go into my apps and run the resync, which means I need to rerun my server to reload the environment variables, and then I'll go ahead and hit resync app, and hopefully this syncs correctly. At this point, if it says synced app, I should be able to just test it and let it run. If it doesn't sync that, then I might not be able to test it and let it run. And so let's go ahead and test it out. I'll go into my post here. I'm going to go ahead and do another prod, let's say prod test here, and for the correct user, and share now, share on LinkedIn, save and continue. Looks like things are going. I refresh, share start at. That's a good sign that it's actually working in terms of my system. I go into Ingest Cloud directly. I should be able to see runs in here, and I see that it is running, and it's running exactly like it was in development, but now of course it's production ready. So we're really, really close to what we need to do to be fully production ready. The next part is really just rotating these keys, getting into the habit of rotating, in which case you now see the two different environment variables that you'll need in here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new signing key. I'll do this rotation process by creating a new key here. And let me just refresh on my account. There's my new key. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the new key, and I will paste right here. The fallback key, which of course is this environment variable, is going to be the current key, the one you just had, and in which case I'll go ahead and bring that in just like that. Okay, so these are now different keys, and now I can go ahead and hit rotate key, and we should be good. I might have to restart my server to make sure the environment variables are working, and then I also might want to resync my app just to make sure all of that's working. In my case, it worked just fine. Now you also might want to have your event keys in here, which you can create as many as you want. So you say ABC123, I'm going to go ahead and create a new key, in which case I'll copy that and bring it in as my ingest event key as well, and then I'll just run that server, and that should be fine. So this is a little bit different. We didn't really cover the event keys too much, but as long as your app is running here, you should be in good shape to now be production ready. So realistically, all you would need to do from here is adjust your Django project so it's production ready, and then go into production. Ingest itself is now production ready. So you actually don't need to use the Docker one at all. You can just use the ingest one, assuming your Cloudflare domain tunnel is working itself. So again, that zero trust in here. Oops, not on this one. Let me jump into the correct one. Zero trust networks tunnels, making sure that this is up and working. And if you go back into tunnels, you'd want to see something like healthy in there in order for you to just fully now in development mode use the ingest production, which of course you could also create other environments in here, right? So you could just create one called dev in here, in which case you would have a dev one, and in your dev environment would have its own keys as well, which is probably what you would want to do, is separate out the environments so that you aren't mix and matching your environments, because your app itself, when you go to sync that new app, you would just have a different domain name on your production one and your local one. Now you could also have just a subdomain. You don't have to have an entire full domain. So like your dev one could just be dev dot. I probably would do dev ABC123 or some kind of weird dev name that only really works for, that's going to be kind of hard to guess. So this one's not that hard to guess, but if you put some gibberish in here, there, now you have a pretty, well, it's probably not that great of a dev name still. You'd probably want to not use it on your main production domain name, but overall it at least would, you know, hide it a little bit more if you're not quite ready to buy just another domain name, which, you know, is like $12 a year. So it might be well worth it to just get that domain name so you can have a production version and a development version. But this process is really, really straightforward. And honestly, you can get a very far way just by using the Docker version as well, as we saw throughout this entire course. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this. Now, I will say there is a good challenge to undertake right now, and that is adding another social platform. I would say you try out Facebook and see how you might automate it, just like we did with LinkedIn. That would mean you'd build out a Facebook app that has OAuth, then you log in through Django AllAuth and you do all of that, then just start using the Facebook SDK along with everything we did with LinkedIn, then add it into this workflow automation that we built. Yeah, that's what we built, a workflow automation, because there's multiple nodes, multiple steps. Yes, it is scheduled or can be scheduled sometime in the future, but overall, it's going to make sure that all of those pieces of that function end up working correctly. This gets me excited because I can actually take this to do all sorts of other things. Let's say, for instance, I need to process video and turn it into a bunch of clips. I could totally do that with the same process and using something like FFmpeg as a way to automate that. I could also do something like email drip campaigns where I can send an email to a user that has a link in it. That link is then connected to my Django project on some sort of URL or view. I track that when they clicked that link, it can be unique to every single user. I can track when they click it, and then I can use Inngest to actually send a message to them 3 hours after they click it, whenever they click it. That's super cool. And then of course I can continue that process building out a full-on email workflow that does a lot of really complicated things. Now the other part about this is since it's Python, we can do all sorts of things. We can do pretty much any sort of automation. We can use AI in the mix as well, where you actually call some LLM to do a bunch of things as well and wait for that stuff to happen and finish before you move on to the next step. It really unlocks a whole lot of potential using what Django is really good at, along with what Inngest has built out and is really good at as well, which is managing all of these workflows and these little sub-steps as well. So it's a really cool tool, and I'm really glad that they reached out so we can work together. This has been awesome. I really like Inngest. I want to use it in so many more projects, as I will attempt to do in the near future. Now, of course, if you want to see something, let me know in the comments so I can see what we can build with Inngest or any of the other tools. I want to see it. I want to do it. So thanks again for watching. Look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.